Listen, the first thing he noticed was the blaze itself. Not the color, not the tree, but the direction. Standard orange rectangle nailed clean into a hemlock facing backward, away from the trail instead of along it. He knew it was wrong the moment he saw it because his grandfather had spent 20 years teaching him which way a blaze faces and why that matters in fog, in rain, in dark. The trail had been officially closed 11 days. The gate was padlocked from the outside. The ranger log showed no entries, and the mud pressed into that nail hole had not dried. He finished the loop, drove home without stopping. He has not used that trailhead since, but he hadn't started the morning thinking about trail markers. He'd started it the way he started most Saturdays, thermos of bad coffee balanced on the truck bumper, boots still damp from the week before, the parking area empty except for his truck and the locked gate at the trailhead. The gate had been there for 11 days. Storm damage on the far side, according to the sign zip-tied to the chain. The ranger who'd flagged him down on his way in, just a guy in a green shirt leaning out of a truck window, had waved him through as far as the creek crossing. "Don't go past the blaze where the split oak is," he'd said. "Far side of that is still a mess." Then he'd driven on, and Callum had stood there with his thermos and his paper map and his 11-year habit of hiking this particular loop alone on Saturday mornings. Callum worked in a cubicle. He fixed spreadsheets for a logistics company that handled freight for regional grocery chains. He was 33, methodical, not dramatic. He hiked because it was quiet. He hiked this particular trail because he knew it the way you know a road you've driven 100 times, not consciously, but in the body. He knew where the trail narrowed before the hemlock grove. He knew to count 7 flat stones across the creek. He knew the leaning chestnut snag at the second switchback and the view southeast through the gap at the top of the ridge. He signed the trail log at the kiosk out of habit. The last entry before his was 11 days old. The name was written in pencil, the letters gone soft with humidity. He couldn't make it out. He started up. The hemlock smell hit first, the way it always did after rain, cold and green and dense. The trail was damp without being muddy. His boots had good grip. He moved at a comfortable pace, thermos clipped to his pack, hands free. He wasn't thinking about the gate or the ranger or the storm damage. He was thinking about nothing, which was the point. He'd been walking about 40 minutes when he heard it. A single footstep. Wet leaves, the sound of weight settling into them. Behind him, maybe 20 yards off the trail. He stopped. The sound stopped. He held still for 10 or 15 seconds and heard nothing. No movement, no rustle, no secondary footfall. A deer, he figured. They stepped off trails this way all the time. One loud crack, then freeze. He walked on. He reached the creek crossing. He counted the stones without thinking about it. 7. Crossed without getting his feet wet. On the far side, the trail climbed toward the second switchback and the chestnut snag, and he began moving uphill. It was on the third switchback that he noticed the split oak blaze was gone. He stopped at the tree where it should have been. He knew this tree, wide base, forked about 6 feet up, the fork going in 2 directions like spread fingers. He'd passed it a dozen times. The blaze had been there. He stood close to the bark and looked at the spot where the nail scar should have been. Nothing. Clean bark, slightly rough where the old heartwood pushed through, but no scar, no old rust stain, no square shadow from years of a metal fastener sitting flush against wood. Not missing. Never there. He checked his phone. 1 bar, blinking. He pulled up the trail map, which he'd downloaded months ago. The split oak was marked on it. He looked up the trail, then back at the tree. It was the right tree. He was sure of it. He decided he'd miscounted switchbacks. He continued up. He found it 200 yards further on, and when he saw it, he stopped moving entirely. The blaze was there. Orange, standard issue, fresh looking, but it was nailed facing the wrong direction, away from the trail, toward the downslope, and the mud in the nail hole was wet. Not damp, wet. He pressed one fingertip to it. The mud gave slightly, the way new caulk gives when it hasn't skinned over. Someone had nailed this blaze here within the past few hours. The gate was padlocked from outside. The ranger log showed no one. Callum stood there with mud on his fingertip and a thermos he'd forgotten he was carrying. The footstep sound came again. Wet leaves. Same sound, same weight. Behind him. He didn't turn around. He didn't turn around because he didn't want to be the kind of person who turned around. He told himself it was the same deer, which had looped wide and come back to the trail. Deer did that. He stood still. The sound stopped. Then he looked up the trail. 40 yards ahead, at a point where the path curved left around a boulder, there was another blaze. Same orange, but this one was nailed at knee height, not eye level where blazes went. Knee height. Facing backward, the same as the first. The wood around the nail was darker, suggesting the fastener had been there longer. But the height was wrong. The height was wrong for anyone using the trail. It was the right height for something walking significantly lower to the ground than a person. Callum stood on the trail with the first blaze behind him and the second blaze 40 yards ahead, and the footstep sound gone quiet, and he did not move toward it. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no wind in the canopy. The creek sound from the crossing below had disappeared, which didn't make sense given the distance wasn't more than a quarter mile. He looked at the knee-height blaze. He had come further up the trail than the ranger had allowed. He hadn't noticed it happening. The split oak had been the boundary, and the split oak blaze was gone, and he had walked past where it should have been without realizing. He was past the closure. He had been past it for at least 20 minutes. He looked at the blaze. The blaze faced away from the trail, 40 yards ahead at knee height. Something had placed it there for a reason he could not determine. And something had been behind him, stopping when he stopped, on a trail that had been closed and unsigned for 11 days. He didn't approach the second blaze. That was the decision, and he made it without drama, the way you make a decision when some part of your body has already made it for you, and your brain is just catching up. He stood on the trail, looked at the knee-height blaze one more time, and turned around. He walked back down. He told himself he was being practical. The trail was closed. He'd already gone further than the ranger had allowed. Turning around was the correct thing to do, the sensible thing. And if something in the back of his mind was insisting on it more urgently than sensibility alone required, he didn't examine that too closely. The footstep sound was gone. The trail was quiet in a way he couldn't fully describe later. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet, like a room where something has just left. His own boots on the wet trail seemed too loud. He shortened his stride without deciding to, moving more carefully, placing his feet with more attention than the terrain required. He was maybe 10 minutes into the descent when he heard it again. Wet leaves, one step. Weight settling. Ahead of him. He stopped. His heart did something complicated. The sound was ahead of him, down slope, in the direction he was walking, the direction he had just come from. He had passed that section of trail 3 minutes ago. There had been nothing on it. He had been looking. He told himself it was a different deer. He told himself sound in these hollows moved in ways that were hard to predict. The hemlock canopy, the angle of the slope, temperature layers in the air. He had read about that once, how cold air pooled in certain valleys and bent sound in unexpected directions. It was a reasonable explanation. He kept walking. The footstep did not repeat. He descended through the hemlock grove, past the chestnut snag, down to the second switchback, and then the first, and then the trail leveled toward the creek. He could hear the water again now, which was a relief he didn't want to think too hard about. The fact that he'd been aware of its absence, and the fact that its return felt like something being restored. He reached the creek crossing and stepped onto the first flat stone. He counted them by reflex, the way he always did. He stopped at the fifth stone. He counted again from the beginning. 9. 7 stones. There had been 7 stones when he crossed that morning. He had counted them. He counted them every time. He had crossed this creek on this trail 11 times over 3 years, and he had counted 7 stones every single crossing. He knew the stones, not by memory exactly, but by the way the body knows a familiar sequence. Step, step, gap, longer step, 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 step. 7. Now there were 9. 2 more stones, flat, sitting clean on top of the streambed gravel. Not weathered into the creek bottom the way the others were, not settled at an angle by years of water moving around them. Set, placed, sitting level and clean like someone had put them there while he was up the trail. He crossed without stopping on any of them. At the trailhead, he unlocked his truck, sat down in the driver's seat, and did not immediately start the engine. He sat for probably 2 minutes looking at the gate. The chain was still there. The padlock was still there. The sign about storm damage was still there. The trail log at the kiosk had his signature at the top of the page, and above his signature, the 11-day-old entry in soft pencil. He called the ranger station. 1 bar. The call connected on the 3rd try. He explained who he was, which trail, what he'd found, the backward blazes, the nail hole with wet mud, the knee-height placement. The ranger who answered was not the same man who'd flagged him down that morning. This one was younger sounding, efficient, taking notes. Then Callum mentioned the trail number, and the ranger went quiet. Not the quiet of writing something down. Longer than that. A pause with texture to it. "Which trail did you say?" the ranger asked. Callum told him again. "And the upper section. You said you went past the creek crossing." "Past the split oak mark, or where it should have been. The blaze was gone." Another pause. "Okay, I'm going to make a note of this and we'll have someone go up." "The mud in the nail hole was still wet," Callum said. "Whoever put it there, it wasn't long before I found it." "I understand," the ranger said. "Thank you for calling it in." He said it the way people say things when they want a conversation to end. Callum drove home. He made the 40-minute drive without turning on the radio, which he noticed about 10 minutes in and did not correct. He wasn't thinking consciously about anything. He was doing what the body does when it's still processing, keeping the hands on the wheel, watching the road, staying in the lane. At home, he pulled out his phone and found the photo he'd taken at the creek on a previous trip, a month back. The creek crossing in October light, the stones visible. He counted them in the photo. 7. He sat with that for a while. Then he opened his photo app and looked for the pictures he'd taken that afternoon. He had taken 3. One of the backward blaze, close up. One of the mud in the nail hole. One at the creek crossing on the way back down, taken reflexively as he stepped off the last stone, the way he sometimes photographed the end of a trail without thinking. He looked at the first 2 photos. Then he stopped at the 3rd. He's still not sure what made him stop. He's looked at the other 2 photos several times. They show what he expected: the blaze, the nail, the mud. Clear and still slightly upsetting but explicable. in the way that evidence of something wrong is at least a graspable kind of upsetting. The third photo he has not opened. He knows it's there. He knows it's a photo he took at the creek crossing on the way out, after finding the 9 stones, after the footstep sound moved to somewhere ahead of him on a trail he'd just walked down alone. He knows the photo captures whatever was behind him on the far bank when he stepped off the stones. He hasn't opened it. He doesn't know if he will. The ranger station sent someone up the following week, according to a brief call Callum received. They found the upper section of trail showing storm damage consistent with the closure notice. They did not find any trail blazes placed incorrectly. They did not document any blazes at all in the section he described. Not the backward one, not the knee-height one, not any evidence of fresh nailing on the hemlocks in that area. The ranger didn't ask about the creek stones. Callum didn't bring them up. He still hikes on Saturdays. Different trails. He checks the blaze direction on every marker he passes, the way his grandfather taught him. He signs the trail log at every kiosk. He counts the stones at every creek crossing. The number is always right. He hasn't gone back to that trailhead. He tells himself it's just a different route, a change of scenery, nothing more than that. And maybe that's all it is. But he still hasn't opened the third photo. There are places that feel wrong before anything happens to make them feel wrong. Not haunted house wrong, not horror movie wrong, just a low, persistent sense that the space you're standing in has its own set of rules you haven't been given yet. Dara noticed it about the cabin the moment she stepped onto the porch. She told herself it was the smell, propane and old wood, and the particular cold that accumulates in a building that's been shut up for weeks. She was practical enough to know that empty places smell like empty places. She was tired from the drive. She had a deadline. She let herself in. The rental had come through a small local listing site, the kind with no professional photos and a description typed in a slightly wrong font. Dara had found it at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks behind on a manuscript. Her apartment full of the specific kind of noise that makes concentration feel physically impossible. Upstairs, neighbor, street traffic, the refrigerator cycling on and off. The cabin was listed at $90 a night. It had a propane heater, a small writing desk, no Wi-Fi, and the listing description ended with the phrase, "very quiet." She booked 4 nights before she finished reading. She drove down from Asheville on a Friday, the last 40 miles winding southeast into a part of eastern Tennessee she'd never had reason to visit. The road narrowed in stages, 4-lane to 2-lane to a secondary county road to a private gravel road that the listing specified would take 12 minutes to drive and which actually took 19. The last 4 of which had her gripping the wheel and watching the ditches on either side fill with fallen leaves and standing water from recent rain. The owner had left the key in a magnetic box under the porch railing, as promised. The cabin sat in a small clearing above a creek she could hear but not see from the porch, with a ridge behind it that blocked the western sky and would have made the afternoons dark even in summer. In October, it blocked the light by 3 o'clock. Dara dragged her bags inside in 2 trips and stood in the main room taking stock. One room with a small loft, a ladder rather than stairs, a writing desk below the single east-facing window, a propane heater along the north wall that smelled like it had been recently used, a wood stove she had no intention of touching, a kitchen barely worth the name, 2-burner propane stove, a half refrigerator, a kettle. And at the far end of the room, flush against the south wall, a door. No handle. Just a door, flat against the wall, with a thin gap at the bottom and no visible hardware. She stood and looked at it for a moment, then looked away and started unpacking groceries. The owner arrived 20 minutes later, not to stay, just to check that Dara had found the place and that the heater was working. She was a woman somewhere in her late 60s, gray-haired, unhurried, with the manner of someone who had been doing practical things her entire life and expected to continue doing them. She checked the heater. She showed Dara how the propane valve worked. She pointed out that the east window latch was stiff and needed to be pressed firmly to seat correctly. She looked around the room with the brief, competent look of someone confirming that everything was where it should be. Then she nodded toward the far end of the room. "Door to the back room is stuck," she said. "We keep it that way. Just leave it." Dara looked at the door. "What's back there?" "Storage." She said it without pause, without discomfort, in the same tone she'd used about the propane valve. "Old stuff. Door's been like that for years. Just leave it." She left 10 minutes later, the sound of her truck on the gravel road fading down through the trees, and Dara stood in the cabin in the early dark with the propane heater clicking on and the east window latch that needed pressing, and the door at the far end of the room that had no handle. She made soup. She opened her laptop and worked for 2 hours with moderate success, the kind of progress that happens when your brain is occupied enough to stop fighting. She read the guest book on the kitchen windowsill, a standard composition notebook, entries sparse. The most recent was 8 months ago. A couple from Knoxville, a weekend in February. Nice and quiet, very private. The entry before that was 14 months old. Just 2 words, very quiet. Dara put the guest book down and listened to the cabin. The heater clicked. The creak made its sound. The propane stove had a faint hiss she'd stopped noticing. She went up the ladder to the loft at 9:30 and was asleep by 10. She woke at 2:04 a.m. to the heater cycling off. The silence after it was total. That was the thing about this hollow. When the mechanical sounds stopped, there was nothing to replace them. No road noise, no other structures. Just the creek, which was low enough that distance turned it to something close to silence as well. She lay still and listened to the cabin settle. Old places did this, clicked and shifted as temperatures dropped, the wood adjusting its geometry against the cold. She knew this. She worked it through consciously, the way you do at 2 a.m. in an unfamiliar place when the rational explanation is correct, but hasn't quite reached the part of your brain that controls your heart rate. The knock came from the interior wall, not the exterior wall, where she might have attributed it to a branch or an animal. The interior wall, the shared wall between the main room and whatever was behind the door with no handle. One knock, low, unhurried, deliberate in its spacing, the way a settling sound never is. Then nothing. She lay still for a long time after that. The heater came back on, the clicking resumed. She told herself, old cabins make sounds like this. She told herself, pressure in old walls, temperature changes, pipe knock. She told herself it was possible for a single structural sound to come from an interior wall with nothing behind it but storage and a stuck door. She told herself all of this until she believed enough of it to sleep. In the morning, the cabin looked the way cabins look in daylight, ordinary and slightly shabby, and not frightening at all. She made coffee and sat at the writing desk and worked well for 4 hours. She didn't look at the back room door more than twice. She looked at it twice. The second time, she noticed the gap at the bottom was wider than she remembered. Not dramatically wider, a 1/4 inch maybe. The kind of difference you weren't sure about. She stood across the room and looked at it, and could not decide whether the gap had changed or whether she was simply looking more carefully than she had the night before. She decided she was looking more carefully. She sat back down and worked. That was the first day. The second night, she left the writing desk lamp on when she climbed to the loft, which she told herself was practical, easier to navigate in an unfamiliar space. and which had nothing to do with the single knock from the interior wall the night before. At 1:47 a.m., the knock came again, 3 times, evenly spaced, with the specific patience of something that was not in a hurry. Low and interior, and absolutely, completely distinct from the sound of a cabin settling or a pipe contracting or any of the other explanations she had prepared. 3 knocks. Then silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Dara did not go down the ladder. She made that decision in the first 10 seconds after the 3rd knock faded, and she held it the way you hold something that keeps trying to slip, consciously, with both hands. Going down the ladder meant crossing the main room. Crossing the main room meant walking toward the far wall. She was not going to walk toward the far wall at 1:47 in the morning, and she understood that this was fear making the decision, and she was completely at peace with that. She sat upright in the loft with her back against the sloped ceiling, knees drawn up, phone in her hand. 1 bar. She opened her contacts and looked at 2 names before closing the app. There was nothing anyone could do from Asheville at 1:47 in the morning except worry, and she wasn't ready to say out loud what she'd heard, because saying it out loud meant committing to it. She listened instead. The cabin gave her nothing. The heater ran its cycle. The creak made its distant sound. The writing desk lamp threw its light across the main room floor in a pale rectangle, and the far wall sat at the edge of that light the way it always had, and the door with no handle was in the wall, and the gap at the bottom showed nothing. She watched the gap for a long time. At 2:20, she shifted position and turned her phone flashlight on, angling it downward so it lit the loft floor without casting much into the room below. She kept it on until 4 a.m., when some part of her brain finally released its grip and she slept sitting up, back against the ceiling, and didn't wake until gray light came through the east window. Morning made everything manageable, the way it always did. She climbed down, made coffee, stood in the main room and looked at the door. In daylight, it was just a door. Flush against the wall, no handle, thin gap at the bottom. She walked to within 6 feet of it, stopped, listened. Nothing. The wood was old, slightly warped at the top corner where the frame had shifted at some point. She looked at the gap. She could not determine whether it was wider than it had been the first night. She accepted that she could not determine this and stepped back. She called the owner at 7:12 a.m. The owner answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she was already up, which meant she was someone who woke early and got on with things. Dara explained what she'd heard. 1 knock the first night, 3 knocks the second, interior wall, not pipes, not settling. There was a pause on the line, not a long one, but a pause with a specific quality to it, not surprise, not confusion. Recognition. Was it the knocking? The owner said. It does that sometimes. Old house. Dara waited for more. More didn't come. What does that mean? It does that sometimes? Old houses make sounds. The wall in there shifts. It's nothing to worry about. It was 3 knocks, Dara said. Evenly spaced. It didn't sound like settling. Don't open that door. The owner's voice stayed even, practical, the same tone she'd used about the propane valve. Not alarmed, not apologetic, just instructing. The storage in there isn't organized for guests. Leave it be and you'll be fine. She hung up 2 minutes later, having said nothing further that was useful. Dara stood in the main room with her phone in her hand, and a cup of coffee going cold, and a manuscript she was supposed to finish in 4 miles of mud road between her and the county highway. She thought about leaving. She thought about it with genuine consideration, the way you think about a practical option rather than a dramatic one. The road was passable. Her car was fine. She could pack in 20 minutes. She stayed. The deadline was real. The room was warm. In daylight with coffee, 3 knocks from an old wall was something she could hold at a manageable distance. She sat at the writing desk and worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and the door sat at the far end of the room and did not move, and she did not look at it more than 4 times. She counted. She started loading her car just after noon on the 3rd day, not because anything had happened in the night. The 3rd night had been quiet, the heater cycling, the creek doing its work. Nothing from the interior wall, but because the owner's voice on the phone had settled somewhere in her chest and hadn't moved. It does that sometimes. The particular flatness of it. The absence of surprise. She made 2 trips to the car. On the 2nd trip, coming back to the cabin for her laptop bag and the groceries she hadn't finished, she walked around the north side of the building. The crawlspace vent was there, a rectangular screened opening set into the foundation, about a foot wide and 8 inches tall, positioned on the north wall roughly below where the back room would be. Standard construction. She'd passed it a dozen times getting to and from the car without registering it. The screen was pushed outward, not inward, not missing. Pushed outward, the frame bent slightly at the lower edge. The mesh bowed away from the foundation in a way that was consistent with pressure applied from inside. Something had gone out through that vent, or had used it as an exit. The opening was 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall, and she stood in front of it and understood that there were animals that could fit through a space that size, and she tried to find comfort in that and found some, but not quite enough, because animals came in through vents. They didn't typically push them out. She got her laptop bag, she got the groceries. She locked the cabin door, though she understood that locking it was a gesture more than a protection. She sat in her car for a moment and looked at the north wall of the cabin before she started the engine. She drove the 4 miles of mud road without the radio on. She did not call the owner again. She thought about it during the drive out and decided there was nothing the owner would say that would make the crawlspace vent fit into a category she could live with comfortably, and that the owner had already demonstrated a willingness to let guests stay in that cabin without disclosing whatever she knew. That said enough. 3 days after she got home, Dara opened her laptop and found the rental listing out of habit. The idle, slightly compulsive habit of looking at a place you've stayed in, the way you sometimes look at a hotel on a map after checkout. She found the listing. The price was the same. The availability calendar showed the cabin as open. The photos had changed. She was almost certain they had changed. The original listing had included a photo of the main room taken from near the ladder, looking toward the writing desk in the far wall. She remembered seeing the door in the background of that photo, flush against the wall, no handle, visible in the middle distance. She had noticed it in the listing and thought nothing of it. That photo was gone. The current listing showed the writing desk from a different angle, the east window, the kitchen, the porch. Every photo had been reframed or replaced. The far wall did not appear in any of them. The back room door was not visible in any current listing image. She checked 3 times to make sure she was looking at the same property. The address matched, the description matched, the price matched. The propane heater was in one of the photos. Same position, same make. Just no far wall, no door. She closed the laptop and did not book another solo writing trip for the remainder of that year. She finished the manuscript in her apartment, with the upstairs neighbor and the street traffic and the refrigerator cycling on and off, and she found that none of it bothered her the way it used to. Quiet had stopped feeling like something she wanted to seek out. Marcus was not the kind of man who got lost. He'd been driving rural roads for work since he was 22, subcontractor work mostly, the kind that took him to job sites and places GPS treated as suggestions rather than facts. He'd driven logging roads in 3 states. He'd forded creeks in a work truck to reach properties that didn't exist on any county map. He knew how to read a road the way some people read a room: the grade of it, the drainage, the condition of the shoulder, what the vegetation on either side said about how often it got traffic. Getting lost was for people who didn't pay attention, and Marcus paid attention to everything. He'd eaten at the diner in Calder Gap because it was the only lit building he'd passed in 11 miles, and because it was 20 minutes to 8 and he hadn't eaten since noon. The job site had run long. The GPS had lost a signal somewhere on the mountain above town and had been showing him a blue dot adrift in a gray void for 40 minutes before he gave up and followed the road down into the valley. Calder Gap was 4 blocks long. The diner occupied a converted filling station, the old pump island still visible under a metal awning, the restaurant itself in what had been the garage bay. 2 men at the counter, both older, work clothes, not interested in a stranger. One waitress, somewhere between 40 and 60, moving with the economy of someone who'd been on her feet for 10 hours. Laminated menus, coffee that had been on the burner too long. Marcus ordered a burger and asked if he could get directions to the interstate. The waitress wrote them on a paper napkin without asking which interstate or where he'd come from. She seemed to know the question before he finished it. "Take Hollow Road south at the bottom of the gap," she said, not looking up. "Follows the valley about 6 miles, comes out at the county road. Left on the county road, you'll hit the ramp in 4 miles. That road on the map. It's a road." She refilled his coffee without being asked. He ate. He looked at his phone, still no signal. He unfolded the state road map he kept in the truck's door pocket, a habit from before GPS that he'd never bothered to stop, and found Calder Gap near the bottom of a county grid. He could not find Hollow Road on the map. This was not unusual. Half the roads he drove for work weren't on state maps. He was pulling on his jacket when he tried one more time. He asked the 2 men at the counter if they knew Hollow Road. They looked at each other. One of them, heavy-set, wearing a blaze orange cap, looked back at his coffee mug. The other one looked at Marcus for a moment without expression and said, "It's a road." Same words, different tone. The waitress appeared at his elbow with his check and said, not quietly, but not loudly either, "Don't stop on that road. Doesn't matter why you'd need to, just don't stop." Marcus looked at her. "Why?" "Just don't." She set the check on the table and walked back toward the kitchen. He paid and left a decent tip and told himself it was a mountain thing. Local superstition, road lore, the kind of warning that got passed down through enough generations that nobody remembered what it was originally about. He'd heard similar things before. Don't swim the south bend of that river. Don't park at that trailhead after dark. Don't drive that pass in weather. Every rural place had its list. Most of the time, the list was practical wisdom that had calcified into custom. He found the Hollow Road sign at the bottom of the gap. Hand-lettered on a green post, nothing official. Angled slightly toward the pavement as if something had clipped it once and nobody had straightened it completely. Just past it, another sign. This one hand-painted on a wooden board wired to a fence post. Hollow RD, not maintained past bridge. He pulled onto it at 8:43 p.m. The first mile was rough but passable, patched asphalt that gave way to chip seal, then to packed gravel. The road dropping into the valley floor between 2 long ridges that rose steep on either side. His headlights handled it fine. No other vehicles. No houses visible from the road. Just tree line on both sides and the occasional glimpse of cleared land set back in the dark. The radio found a country station for about 90 seconds, then gave it up to static, then gave up entirely. He turned the radio off. At the 2-mile mark, his headlights picked up something at the edge of the road, the right shoulder, where the gravel petered out into a strip of weedy ground before the tree line. A pair of boots. Work boots, lace up, sitting upright in the gravel with their toes pointing toward the road. No bag nearby, no clothing, no person. Just two boots placed with a neatness that felt considered, heels together, sitting there the way boots sit when someone has taken them off at the door and set them down with the specific carefulness of someone who plans to put them on again. Marcus slowed but did not stop. He thought, hunting. Hunters left gear everywhere. He thought, someone changed into waders at the creek. He thought, it's nothing. He drove past. The one-lane bridge came up a quarter-mile later. Wooden planks, the kind that rattled under the tires. A concrete abutment on either side that had been patched more than once. He crossed it at a crawl, his headlights sweeping the far side as he came off the planks. The road curved left beyond the bridge. In the outer edge of his headlights, at the curve, a figure was standing. Still, facing away from him, toward the curve in the road. Dark clothing, or at least not reflecting the light the way bright clothing would. Standing close enough to the road's edge that he registered it as a person immediately and instinctively eased off the gas. He drove the curve. The figure was gone. Not stepped off the road. Gone. The way something is gone when you've passed it, and it's behind you before your eyes can confirm what they saw. He checked his mirrors. The bridge behind him, the road empty. He kept driving. The fog was heavier now, pressing down into the valley from the ridgetops, and his headlights were doing less work than they should have been, illuminating maybe 40 feet of road before the light dissolved into white. The road felt like it was pulling inward, the tree line closer on both sides than the map had suggested for a maintained county road, even one that wasn't maintained. No shoulder left to speak of, no place to turn around without risking a ditch. He drove for what felt like another mile and a half. At some point, he stopped being sure of the distance. Fog did that, compressed distance, made 2 miles feel like 4, or made 4 feel like 2. He was watching the road and watching his speed and watching the edge of the gravel. And somewhere in all that watching, he did not notice exactly when he decided to stop. He stopped to check the napkin. That was the reason. He unfolded it on the steering wheel and read the directions. Hollow Road South, 6 miles, County Road, and looked up. His headlights showed 40 feet of empty road ahead, fog beyond that. He looked in the rearview mirror, headlights. Behind him, maybe 150 yards back, 2 headlights sitting still in the fog. Not approaching, not receding. Just there, the way a parked car's lights are there, except there had been no vehicle behind him on this road, no turnoff he'd passed, no driveway, no pull-off wide enough for a car to have been waiting. He had been driving for over 2 miles on a road with 1 entrance. He had crossed the only bridge. There was nothing behind him that could have placed another vehicle on this road. He looked at the headlights in the mirror for 40 seconds, counting. They did not move. Marcus put the truck in drive. He did it the way he did most things, without ceremony, without announcing it to himself, because the part of his brain that was still running on pure practicality had decided that sitting stopped on a narrow fog road with unexplained headlights in the mirror was worse than moving, and moving was something he knew how to do. He pulled forward slowly, watching the road ahead and the mirror in alternation, and the headlights behind him moved when he moved, maintaining their distance, not gaining, not falling back, keeping the same 150 yards with the precision of something that had decided on that number. He drove. He told himself it was another vehicle that had pulled off somewhere he hadn't registered, a field access, a gap in the tree line, a turnout hidden in the fog. He told himself the driver was being cautious in the conditions, matching his speed, not wanting to close the gap on a narrow road. He told himself there was a version of this that was completely ordinary. 2 vehicles on a rural road in fog, and he kept telling himself that with the patient repetitiveness of a man who knows he is trying to convince himself of something. The road curved and dipped, and he lost the headlights in the mirror for 30 seconds, then found them again on a straight stretch. Same distance. He passed the spot where the boots had been. He knew it by the bent guardrail post he'd noted on the way in. A single post at the road's edge, leaning outward, old rust on the corrugated metal. He looked at the shoulder as he passed. The boots were gone. He drove past the empty gravel where they'd been, and he did not stop, and he did not slow down, and he looked in the mirror, and the headlights were still there, and he faced forward and kept his speed. 4 miles in, he thought he saw the figure again. Left shoulder this time, not the right. Standing 20 feet ahead, at the edge of his headlight's reach, in the same posture as before. Facing away, not toward him, sideways to the road with its attention directed somewhere into the trees. Same dark clothing, same stillness. He drove toward it. He did not slow. He passed the exact spot and there was nothing there, nothing at the road's edge, nothing retreating into the tree line, just gravel, and then the darkness beyond the gravel where the headlights didn't reach. He checked the mirror. The following headlights had not changed their distance. The figure had been on the left side. He had first seen it on the right side of the road, at the curve past the bridge. Now it was on the left side, ahead of where he'd already driven. He could not account for that. He ran through the options. 2 people, 1 on each side, which required 2 people coordinating on a road with no logical reason for anyone to be on it at 9 o'clock at night in heavy fog. Fog creating a visual artifact, some reflective combination of his own lights bouncing off something he hadn't identified. His eyes manufacturing shape from movement and exhaustion. He chose the last option and kept driving. He expected the county road at the 6-mile mark. The waitress's directions had been specific. 6 miles, left on the county road, 4 miles to the ramp. He watched his odometer. At 6 miles, the road continued. At 7 miles, the road continued. He checked the odometer twice, thinking he'd misread the starting point. The road continued. Fog, gravel, tree line pressing in on both sides. The following headlights in the mirror holding their position with a patience that had stopped feeling coincidental. At what his odometer read as 8.5 miles from the bridge, the road ended. Not a dead end, it opened. The gravel widened into a flat pull-off area, and then connected to a paved surface running perpendicular, a state highway with a center line visible through the thinning fog. He pulled forward onto the pavement and stopped and sat there with his truck idling and the heater running and his hands on the wheel. He looked in the mirror. The road behind him was empty, no headlights. He could see back about 60 yards before the fog took it, and there was nothing on the road, no vehicle approaching, no headlights, no movement. He watched for a full minute. Nothing came out of the fog. He became aware, in the way you become aware of something that should have registered earlier, that the road behind him was gated. He put the truck in reverse and backed up 2 car lengths, leaning out the window to look. A metal gate, the tubular kind used on farm and fire roads, was closed across the entrance to Hollow Road. Padlocked. A posted sign wired to the gate frame, the words not visible from his angle. The gate was old, paint-worn, some surface rust, but the padlock on the chain looked newer. He had driven through that gate, or he had entered from the other end, at the hand-lettered sign, and this gate was a second entrance he hadn't seen on the way in. But the road had gone in one direction. He had not passed a second gate. He had driven forward the entire way without turning and without reversing, and now there was a locked gate at the road's entrance behind him, and he had no memory of passing through it. He looked at the gate for a long moment, then turned forward, checked his mirrors one more time. Empty road in both directions, the fog beginning to lift at the edges where the valley opened to the state highway, and pulled onto the pavement. He found his phone had a signal again. 4 bars, the sudden abundance of it almost startling. He checked the time. 9:41. The drive had taken him nearly an hour for what the waitress had said was 6 miles. He drove the remaining 40 minutes to his motel without turning the radio on. He told his brother the story about 3 months later. Not because he'd been planning to, it came out sideways. The way things come out when you've been carrying them without acknowledging that you've been carrying them. They were on the phone, something about a different job, different roads. And Marcus said the name of that part of Tennessee, and his brother asked if he'd passed through Calder Gap, and Marcus said yes, actually. And then the story came out. His brother, the one who is telling this account now, the one who says he still thinks about it more than Marcus ever seemed to, asked what Marcus thought was on Hollow Road. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I asked someone in that diner before I left. I asked what was on Hollow Road that I should know about. What did they say?" "Nobody answered," Marcus said. "Not the 2 guys at the counter, not the waitress. I asked, and they all just didn't answer, like I hadn't said anything." His brother asked if he'd ever looked into it, whether Hollow Road showed up anywhere, whether anyone else had reported anything similar. Marcus said he'd looked once. The road didn't appear on any county map he could find. The state road database for that county had no record of a maintained or unmaintained road by that name in that grid. He'd tried satellite maps and found what might have been the valley, the 2 ridges, the rough shape of the terrain. But the image for that specific section was low resolution, the kind that suggested the photography pass had been incomplete or had failed. He'd looked once and then stopped looking. The boots, his brother says, are the detail that stays with him. Not the figure, not the following headlights, not the locked gate or the missing miles or the road that shouldn't have existed. The boots. Upright in the gravel, heels together, toes toward the road, placed with a neatness that implied deliberateness, implying ownership, implying that whoever had taken them off had expected to return for them, and then gone when he passed again. Marcus still drives rural roads for work. He still covers that part of Tennessee occasionally, different routes, different valleys. He keeps the paper map in the door pocket and checks it more often than he used to. He does not drive after dark if he can avoid it. When he can't avoid it, he does not stop on rural roads for any reason, not to check directions, not to check a map, not to look at something at the road's edge. He pulls through or he pulls off somewhere lit, somewhere with other vehicles, somewhere that has a second exit. He has not driven through Calder Gap again. His brother, when he tells the story, always ends it the same way, with the thing Marcus said about the diner, the question that didn't get an answer, because that part, the brother says, bothers him more than the road itself. The waitress who wrote down the directions before Marcus finished asking. The 2 men who had the same response to the same question. The specific quality of the silence when Marcus asked what was on Hollow Road. Like they all knew, his brother says. Like they'd known before he walked in. Like they'd seen people come through Calder Gap before, asking about the road south, and had worked out exactly how much to say and exactly when to stop saying it. Everett had worked the same district for 19 years, and in 19 years he had developed a particular kind of relationship with the land that comes not from love of it exactly, but from long familiarity, the way you know a difficult neighbor, their habits and rhythms, and the specific ways they could cause you problems if you weren't paying attention. He knew which trails washed out first after heavy rain. He knew which campgrounds attracted trouble in midsummer and which ones emptied out by the third week of October. He knew the service roads by the sound they made under his truck and the fire towers by their individual quirks. The one on Bear Pen that had a door that wouldn't latch unless you lifted it slightly. The one on Cold Spring that got ice on the exterior stairs 3 weeks before anywhere else on the ridge. He knew the tower on Alderman Knob the way he knew all of them. He'd done overnight fire watch there 11 times over the years, more than any other tower in his rotation. At 4,200 feet, it caught weather from 2 directions, and in dry October conditions it offered the best sight lines on the district's eastern exposure. He drove the service road up at 5:30 in the afternoon, unlocked the cab, ran through his equipment check the way he'd done it 100 times, and settled in for what he expected to be a quiet night. He'd brought a thermos of coffee, a foil-wrapped sandwich, his logbook, and a novel he suspected he wouldn't read. He set up his bunk. He tested the radio on Channel 1, got a clean signal from dispatch, confirmed his position and assignment. He noted the weather. Overcast, wind from the northwest at 12 miles an hour, gusting to 20. Humidity low enough to keep the fire risk at moderate. He entered all of this in the logbook and looked out the cab windows at the last light, leaving the eastern ridgeline. Then, as he always did at the start of a tower assignment, he picked up the historical logbook. Every fire tower in the district kept 2 logs, a working log for the current season, where rangers entered their observations and any incidents, and a historical logbook, a hardbound ledger going back decades, where entries accumulated in different hands across different years. Some rangers wrote a line or 2. Some wrote paragraphs. Everett had read through the Alderman Knob historical log 3 or 4 times over the years, finding it useful the way old knowledge is useful, not always directly applicable but orienting. The way knowing a place's past makes the present easier to read. He flipped through it now without intent, not reading carefully, letting pages turn. Dry summers from the 1980s. A lightning strike in 1994 that had required a 2-day watch. A bear that had learned to open the cab door. A problem documented across 4 separate entries in 2003 before it was resolved. The handwriting changed across decades. Some entries neat and formal, some quick and cramped. He was near the back when a page turned and showed him an entry that was different from the others. Not different in length. It was short, 2 lines. Different in character. Most entries documented conditions, observations, incidents. This one was a note, the kind you leave for a specific reader. The handwriting was careful, as if the writer had thought about how to form the words before committing them. If the radio calls your name on Channel 3, do not respond. Log it and wait for morning. No signature, no date written in the standard location at the top of the entry. He checked the entries before and after, tried to establish a timeline from context. The entries surrounding it suggested it had been written sometime in the past 5 or 6 years, but he couldn't narrow it further. He looked at it for a while. Then he took out his phone and photographed the page. Standard protocol for unusual logbook entries, anything that might require a follow-up, and set the historical log aside. He told himself it was superstition. Mountain country generated this kind of thing the way mountains generated weather, reliably and in quantity. Every district had its folklore, its warnings, its things rangers weren't supposed to do or say or follow. He'd heard versions of most of them over 19 years, and had treated them with the same respectful skepticism he brought to most things, worth noting, not worth fear. He ate his sandwich. He drank the first third of his thermos. He watched the cloud cover thicken from the northwest and made a note about possible precipitation before morning. He checked in with dispatch at 8 o'clock. All clear, no units in his immediate area, no incidents reported. He set his radio on the bunk beside him, channel 1 active, volume low enough to sleep through routine traffic but loud enough to register a call. At 10:15, channel 3 produced a burst of static. He noted the time and the channel and the duration, approximately 4 seconds, and went back to what he was doing. Channel 3 was a maintenance frequency, used for equipment coordination during non-emergency periods. During overnight assignments, it carried no traffic. Static on a maintenance channel in mountainous terrain with changing weather conditions was not unusual. Atmospheric interference did strange things to radio frequencies at elevation, and the cloud cover moving in from the northwest was the kind that played with transmission. He wrote in his working log, CH3 static burst 2215 approx. For sec, no content. Atmos. He did not touch channel 3. He read 12 pages of the novel he'd brought and retained nothing. The wind had picked up. He could feel it in the cab, the tower swaying its fraction of an inch the way it always did in sustained gusts, something you stopped noticing after the first hour and started noticing again after midnight when everything else was quiet. He checked the exterior light below the cab. The bulb threw its cone of yellow light onto the service road and the surrounding ground, 40 feet of visibility before the tree line took it. Nothing moving. At 11:40, channel 3 transmitted again. Longer this time, 8 or 10 seconds, and inside the static something that had shape, not clear enough to resolve into words, not degraded enough to dismiss as pure interference. The kind of signal that makes you pick up the handset and hold it without keying the transmit button, which is whatever it did. He held the handset and listened, and the transmission ended, and he set the handset back down. He looked at the logbook note. "Do not respond," he wrote. CH3 transmission, 2340, 8 to 10 CK, possible voice content, indistinct. No response given, monitoring. He thought about calling dispatch on channel 1 to report the anomaly. He decided to wait. 2 static events on a maintenance channel during a windy night at elevation, one of them with possible but unclear voice content, was not yet something that required waking a duty officer. He would log it and report in the morning if nothing further developed. He turned off the cab's interior light and sat in the dark. The exterior light below him ran on its own circuit, timer-controlled, and would stay on until 4 in the morning. He could see its edge from the windows, the circle of yellow light below, the hard line where the light ended and the dark began. The tree line, another 150 feet beyond that. He had been sitting in the dark for about 40 minutes, the wind steady, the tower making its small adjustments against it, when channel 3 opened again. Clear, no static preamble. 2 words, said once, in a voice with no distortion, no equipment artifacts, no echo, no compression. The voice was steady and unhurried, the way a person sounds when they are saying something they have already decided to say. The voice said his name, first and last. His full name, the name on his ranger identification, the name dispatch used when they needed to be precise. 2 syllables, then 3, with the emphasis exactly correct, in a voice he had never heard and did not recognize, on a channel that carried no authorized traffic, and that could not, under any atmospheric explanation he knew, produce a clear, undistorted, 2-word transmission without a corresponding signal source. The transmission ended. He sat in the dark cab with his hand on the handset and the logbook open, and the note visible even in the low light. Do not respond. The tower swayed once in a gust. The exterior light below him illuminated its 40 feet of empty ground. The channel was silent. He waited to see if it would speak again. He set the handset down without keying it. That was the whole decision. The entire act of will compressed into one small motion. Setting the handset down, removing his hand from it, placing both hands flat on the logbook in front of him. The note was still visible in the low light from the exterior below. He did not need to read it again. He had read it enough times that it had moved from his eyes into somewhere more immediate. He wrote in the working log, "Ch3 transmission, 0055, clear. 2 words. Full name, no distortion. No response given." He wrote it in the same handwriting he used for weather observations and fuel levels and bear sightings. He made himself write it that way. Then he sat back and watched the windows. The cab was 8 feet by 8 feet, glass on all 4 sides at standing height. The kind of visibility that felt reassuring in daylight and exposed at night. He could see the exterior light below, the service road, the cleared ground around the tower's base, the edge of the cone where the light stopped. Beyond that, the tree line was a black mass that the exterior light did not reach and his eyes could not penetrate. The wind moved the upper canopy in long, slow waves he could see against the clouds themselves moving fast enough to occasionally show and then close over a section of sky. He checked the working log entry for 10:15, then 11:40, then the one he'd just written. 3 transmissions over the course of 2.5 hours, each one cleaner and more deliberate than the last. He thought about the note's author, someone who had sat in this cab, in this chair, and heard the same progression. Someone who had decided that the correct response was to write 2 lines in a historical logbook and leave them for whoever came next. No signature, no date, no explanation. Just the instruction and the implication behind it, that there was a reason not to respond, that the reason was one the author considered self-evident, that the author had weighed the options and landed on silence as the only defensible one. Everett had been a ranger for 19 years. He had a practical mind and a professional tolerance for ambiguity, and he had just heard his own full name come out of a radio channel that carried no authorized traffic, spoken in a voice he didn't recognize, with no atmospheric explanation that fit the clarity of the transmission. He turned the historical logbook page. He wasn't sure what made him do it. He had already registered the note and photographed it, but he turned the page, and on the back of the same leaf, in the same careful handwriting, there was more. "It knows how you sound, it learned from the channel. When it calls you again, go to the window." He read it twice. He did not go to the window. He positioned himself on the bunk with his back against the cab's interior wall, facing the windows, and he stayed there. He could see the exterior light's edge from that position, and the tops of the nearest trees, and the cloud-covered sky. He could see 3 of the 4 cab walls and had his back against the 4th. He left the working log open on the bunk beside him. He held the handset in his lap without touching the key. At 1:30 in the morning, Channel 3 transmitted again. Longer this time, 10 or 12 seconds. And this time he understood, in the first 2 seconds, why the note's author had written what they wrote, because the voice that came through the radio was his voice. Not a similar voice, not a voice with the same regional inflection or the same approximate register. His voice, his specific cadence, the way he clipped certain consonants, the particular rhythm of his speech that he would have recognized in a recording the way you recognize your own face in a photograph. His voice was saying something on Channel 3 at 1:30 in the morning, and he was sitting in the cab not saying it. The sentence was complete, grammatically ordinary, and it was something he had never said on any work radio in 19 years of service, something that had no business being on any radio frequency, because it was something he had said once at home, to his wife, the night before the assignment. A private thing. A thing said in a kitchen at 9 o'clock at night with no radio equipment in the room, and no reason for it to exist anywhere outside that conversation. The transmission ended. He did not write in the working log. He looked at the windows. The exterior light below showed the same 40 feet of cleared ground, the service road, the base of the tower. He sat with his back against the wall, and he did not go to the window, and he did not key the handset, and he did not call dispatch, because there was nothing he could say to dispatch that would be useful, and because he understood with the specific clarity that comes from having no remaining alternative explanations that he was going to stay exactly where he was until daylight. At 3:15, the exterior light below the cab showed movement at the tree line. He was looking at the windows when it happened, which meant he saw it in real time rather than catching it from the corner of his eye. At the far edge of the cone of light, where the cleared ground met the first trees at the base of the service road, movement. Slow. Something moving through the edge of the light's reach, not clearly visible, not resolving into a shape he could categorize from that height and distance. He registered height and deliberateness and the pale quality of it in the yellow light, and then it moved out of the light's reach into the dark beyond, and he did not see it again. He noted the time in the working log and stopped writing before he wrote a description. He sat with the pen over the paper for a moment and then closed the log. He did not sleep. He sat on the bunk with his back against the wall and watched the windows until the sky at the eastern edge began to separate from the ridge below it, the specific gray that comes before actual light, the gray that means the night is ending even if it hasn't ended yet. He found that gray more comforting than he would have predicted. At 6:10, when the light was full enough to see the ground below clearly, he gathered his gear, wrote his final weather observation in the working log, and climbed down the tower stairs. The service road was muddy from the overnight condensation. He walked it toward his truck, which was parked at the bottom of the access area, and when he reached the point where the cleared ground met the tree line at the base of the road, the spot where the exterior light's cone ended, the spot where movement had been at 3:15, he stopped. One boot print. Human-shaped, the heel and ball and toe of a boot pressed into the mud beside the service road, pointing uphill toward the tower. No other prints around it. Not a set of tracks approaching and leaving. One print, as if someone had stepped once and then ceased to continue. The mud around it was undisturbed. The print itself was deep enough to suggest weight, real weight, a person's worth of pressure applied to soft ground. He looked at it for a while. He took a photograph with his radio handset the same way he had photographed the logbook note. Then he walked to his truck, put his gear in, and drove down the mountain. He filed his working log with dispatch and reported the Channel 3 anomaly as radio interference, possible equipment fault, recommended inspection. He did not include the logbook note in his formal report. He did not include the transmission content. He did not include the boot print or the movement at the tree line. He filed those things in a different place. Not in any system, not in any document. Just in the category of things he'd experienced that he couldn't hand to anyone else without losing something essential in the translation. The radio inspection found nothing wrong with the equipment. The technician who ran the inspection noted that the hardware was in normal working condition, and the Channel 3 showed no evidence of malfunction or unusual traffic. Atmospheric interference remained the working explanation. No further action was recommended. 6 months after the Alderman Knob assignment, Everett requested a transfer off fire tower duty. The form asked for a reason. He wrote, seeking reassignment to ground operations for career development. Nobody questioned it. He retired 8 months after that. He told the story once to a hiking club newsletter that ran a column of allegedly true ranger accounts, submitted anonymously, details changed at the author's request. The newsletter editor, who is the source of this account, said that Everett had been precise and unhurried in the telling, and had included every detail exactly as described here, with one exception. There was one detail Everett had left out of the newsletter submission. One detail he mentioned to the editor in conversation but asked not to publish. The sentence his voice had spoken on Channel 3 at 1:30 in the morning. The sentence was about his wife. He had said it to her in their kitchen the night before the assignment. Something personal. Something that belonged to a specific moment between two people and nowhere else. He had not said it on any radio. He had not said it to any colleague. He had said it once, in a room with no equipment, and it had come back to him out of a maintenance channel on a mountain at 4,000 feet in the middle of the night, in his own voice, with his own rhythm, with the emphasis in exactly the right place. He never found out how it knew. He still doesn't have an explanation that covers that part. Not the equipment fault theory, not the atmospheric skip theory, not any version of events that accounts for semantic content in a voice that matched his own, saying something that lived only in one kitchen on one evening and should have stayed there. His wife knows the story. He told her when he retired. She asked him once what the sentence was, the one that came back to him on the radio. He told her. She remembered saying it. She remembered the evening, the kitchen, the context. She asked him not to repeat it to anyone else. He hasn't. The camp host had a way of delivering information that made it sound like he was telling you something you should have already known. Not unkind about it, just direct. The way people are direct when they've said a thing enough times that the social padding around it has worn off. He pulled up to Priya's campsite in his golf cart at 4:15 in the afternoon, while she was still staking out her rainfly, and he sat in the cart and watched her work for a moment before he spoke. "Site 14, he said. Not a question. "That's what I booked." She straightened up and looked at him. He was somewhere in his late 60s, gray stubbled, wearing a canvas jacket that had been through enough seasons to lose its original color. He had the unhurried quality of someone who lived in a campground year-round and had made his peace with that decision completely. He looked at the tree line behind her tent pad. The hardwoods back there were mostly bare, October having taken the leaves down to the last stubborn ones, and the light came through the trunks in long, thin bars that would be gone in an hour. He looked at them the way a person looks at something they've looked at many times and have reached a conclusion about. "You're going to hear things tonight," he said. "It's a noisy woods this time of year. Things moving around, acorns coming down, deer." He paused. "But if you hear something that sounds like a person asking for help, don't unzip." Priya had her mallet in her hand. She looked at him. "Don't unzip," he said again, as if repetition was the clarification. Then he put the golf cart in reverse, turned it around, and drove back up the loop road without waiting for her to respond. She stood at her tent and watched the cart until it went around the curve. She was 28. She had camped in state forests a dozen times, car camping mostly, with friends or a partner, and twice alone in the past 2 years. She was comfortable with it, not the aggressive kind of comfortable that required proving something, just the ordinary kind that came from having done it enough to know what the sounds were. Rain, wind, animals, other campers at a distance. She had a good tent, a 3-season that handled cold well, and she'd set up in sites further from facilities than this before, without issue. She decided the camp host was an eccentric old man, the kind that accumulated in seasonal campgrounds the way eccentrics accumulated in any place, with low overhead and no social pressure to explain yourself. She finished staking the rainfly. The campground had 22 sites, and 4 of them were occupied. She'd counted on her way in. Site 1, where the camp host's trailer sat at the loop entrance, lights and a small propane tank visible. Site 6, a couple with a screen tent she'd seen through the trees. Site 11, a truck camper with no activity visible. Site 14, hers, at the far end of the loop where the road curved back on itself and the spacing between sites opened up. The nearest occupied site was 6, which was roughly 200 yards away through the trees. She made a fire in the ring, ate from her camp stove, soup, the kind in a pouch, efficient rather than good, and sat with her camp chair pulled close to the flames until 8:30. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was down, the way October temperatures dropped in the Carolina mountains, a change that felt deliberate. She hung her food bag from the line between 2 trees at the edge of her site, tied it off correctly, and took her headlamp and her camp shoes and went into the tent at 9. She texted her friend from college, the friend who was the designated contact, who knew where she was and when she planned to drive out. 1 bar, the message sending slowly. At site, all good. Out Sunday. The response came back in pieces. Have fun, don't get eaten by bears, text Monday. She put the phone on the sleeping bag beside her, noted the battery at 60%, and started reading on her phone's reader app. The fire outside was dying down to coals. She could see its light through the rainfly, orange and dimming. She was awake enough to read for maybe 40 minutes before she put the phone down and lay back and listened to the campground settle into its late-night sounds. Distant wood pop from the fire at Site 6, the sound carrying in cold air. Wind in the bare hardwood tops, a different sound from summer, drier, the branches clicking against each other without leaves to soften it. Somewhere down the ridge an owl worked through its call and waited for an answer and worked through it again. She turned on her side and was most of the way to sleep when she heard the first sound at 11:15. A brushing contact along the side of the tent. Light, the way a branch brushes if wind moves it against the fabric. Except there was no wind at that moment. The branch clicking in the canopy had stopped and the air was still. The brushing continued for 2 or 3 seconds, moving from the back corner of the tent toward the middle of the side wall, then stopped. She lay still, listened. A raccoon, probably. They moved along tent walls this way, following a smell, and her tent was nylon and had no smell a raccoon would want, but raccoons investigated things on their own logic. She was familiar with this explanation, and it was a good one. She listened for the scratching of claws, the weight of a raccoon on the tent's guy leans, the sounds that would confirm the identity. She heard nothing further. After 5 minutes, she let herself believe the explanation and closed her eyes. At 12:40, the sound came back. Different. Not a brush, a drag. Slow and horizontal along the base of the tent, at ground level, the sound of something maintaining contact with the tent fabric while moving deliberately along it. Not the intermittent contact of an animal crossing a corner. A sustained, continuous contact, moving with the specific patience of something that was not crossing the tent but following it. She lay still and tracked the sound. It began at the back left corner, moved along the back wall, turned at the right corner, continued along the right side. It was going around the tent. She did not move. She controlled her breathing with a conscious effort, keeping it slow, keeping it quiet. The sound continued around the front of the tent, paused at the door panel for 3 or 4 seconds, long enough for her to become very aware of the zipper pull hanging on the interior side of the door, and the fact that the zipper was the only thing between the inside and the outside, and the fact that zippers work from both sides, and then continued around to the left wall. It completed the circuit and returned to the back left corner where it had begun. Then it started again. She was not a person who panicked. She ran through the explanations methodically, the way she ran through anything. Raccoon, skunk, opossum, bear, all of them possible, some of them common. A bear investigating a tent by walking its perimeter was documented behavior, and a bear was large enough to produce the sustained contact she was hearing. A bear was also large enough to be dangerous, and if there was a bear circling her tent, The correct response was to make noise and make herself known. She did not make noise. She thought about the camp host, the specific grammar of what he'd said. If you hear something that sounds like a person asking for help, not. If you hear something scary, if you hear an animal, if you hear something big, a specific category, something that sounds like a person asking for help. And the instruction that followed it was about the zipper, not about noise, not about bear spray, not about any of the responses that made sense for an animal. The circuit around the tent completed a second time. The sound paused at the back left corner, the starting point, as if marking position. Then a voice. Right outside the door panel, close enough that there should have been no distance in it at all. Close enough that she could hear the texture of it. The way a voice sounds when you're near enough to the person that you're not just hearing the sound, but feeling the air it displaces. Hello? Conversational. Unhurried. Exactly the way a person says hello when they've walked up to your door and knocked and are now waiting for you to answer. No distress in it, no particular need, just the ordinary opening of ordinary contact. She did not move. She did not answer. Her thumb found the interior zipper pull and slid through the ring and held it. The camp host's words were in her head with a specificity she was grateful for. Not a vague warning, not a general unease, but a precise instruction that she was now holding onto the way you hold onto a railing in the dark. Don't unzip. She did not unzip. She held the pull from the inside and did not move and did not answer. The voice said, "Hello?" Again, same word, same intonation, same unhurried conversational register. And that was when she found the thing that was wrong about it. The thing she hadn't identified in the first instance but heard clearly in the second. It was identical. Not similar, not approximately the same. Identical. The way a recording is identical to itself when you play it twice. No variation in emphasis, no slight difference in breath, no change in the ambient quality of the sound. Human speech didn't do that. Human speech was always slightly different the second time, even if you were trying to repeat yourself exactly. This was the same sound played again. She held the zipper pull and did not answer and waited. The second hello faded, and the night went quiet in a way that felt less like absence and more like attention. She stayed exactly where she was, left hand through the zipper pull ring, right hand flat on the sleeping bag, back of her head against the inflatable pillow she'd brought because she was someone who slept better with her neck supported and had decided that comfort mattered even on solo trips. She focused on that pillow, on the specific ordinary fact of it. The way you focus on something grounded when the alternative is to let your mind move toward what it wants to move toward. The dragging sound did not resume. She counted her breaths. She got to 60 before she realized she was counting and stopped. The fire at Site 6 had gone completely out. No light visible through the rainfly, which meant the couple there had gone to bed, which meant that the 200 yards of dark woods between Site 6 and Site 14 was full of sleeping people who could not hear her and could not help her and did not know what was outside her tent. Her phone showed 12:58. Battery at 51%, one bar that flickered to no signal and back. She thought about calling out, about making noise, about the bear spray in the mesh pocket of the tent's inner wall, 6 inches from her right hand, and what it would mean to use it, and whether she could use it in a space this small without also using it on herself. She thought about unzipping, not all the way, just enough to look, just enough to see, and she thought about the camp host's face when he'd said, "Don't unzip," and the way he'd said it twice, as if the second time was for the version of her that would try to negotiate with the instruction. She did not unzip. At 1:45, the tent wall pressed inward. Not the door panel, the left side wall midway along it, about chest height from the ground, which meant about chest height from someone crouching or kneeling outside. The fabric moved inward slowly. A deliberate pressure applied and then held, the tent pole on that side flexing slightly under the load. She could see the indentation in the darkness, the wall bowing toward her, and she pressed herself toward the right side of the tent without making a sound and watched it. The pressure held for 4 or 5 seconds. Then it released, the wall returning to its shape, the pole straightening. Then silence. She sat with her back against the right wall and her thumb through the zipper pull, and she did not sleep and she did not move. And she watched the left wall and the door panel, and she measured time by her own breathing until the rain fly began to show the first gray of pre-dawn light, which happened at 6:08 by her phone. She waited until the light was full and unambiguous, until she could see the shadows of tree trunks through the fly, until the camp host's golf cart motor was audible somewhere up the loop. She heard it at 6:40, the small electric whir of it doing its morning round. She waited until she could hear birds, then she unzipped. The morning was cold and clear, the sky through the bare hardwoods a pale blue that felt like an apology. She stood at the tent door in her camp shoes and looked at the site. Fire ring, camp chair, stove on the picnic table. Everything where she'd left it. The food bag still hanging correctly between the 2 trees. She walked around the tent. The leaf litter around the perimeter was disturbed. Not catastrophically, not the way a large animal disturbs ground. Not overturned or compressed in one place. Disturbed in a line, a continuous arc following the tent's shape, leaves displaced and shuffled the way they were when something had moved along the base of the tent at ground level. The arc was complete, all the way around, following the circuit she had tracked by sound in the dark. At the front left corner near the door panel, the leaves were more disturbed than elsewhere. Compressed in a rough oval, the kind of compression consistent with something having crouched or knelt for a period of time. No clear print, the leaves prevented that, but the oval was specific enough in its location to be pointed. She stood and looked at it for a while. Then she walked up the loop road to Site 1. The camp host was outside his trailer with a mug of coffee, standing the way people stand in the morning when they're not doing anything yet, just being upright, watching the light. He looked at her when she came around the curve and his expression did not change, which she later thought was its own kind of information. No surprise. He had given her that instruction and he had waited to see her in the morning, and her being here was the outcome he had apparently anticipated. She told him what she'd heard, the circuit, the contact, the voice, twice, identical both times. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Did you unzip?" "No." He nodded. He looked into his coffee mug. He said, "Good." The way you say good when the answer's the one you needed it to be. She waited for more. He looked up at the tree line beyond Site 14, visible from where they stood. He looked at it the way he'd looked at it the afternoon before, not with fear, not with particular curiosity, with the settled expression of someone who has spent years looking at a thing and has stopped expecting it to explain itself. "Is this something that happens here?" she asked. He drank his coffee. "It's a noisy woods," he said. She understood that was all she was going to get. She broke camp. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about most things, rolling the sleeping bag and the pad, and deflating the pillow and collapsing the poles in the correct sequence, because doing it correctly was something she could control. She loaded her car in 4 trips. She did not linger. Before she pulled out, she drove to Site 6. The couple there were loading their own car, a Saturday morning checkout. Nothing unusual on their faces. She got out and asked, casually as she could manage, whether they'd heard anything in the night. The man looked at his partner and then back at Priya. "Heard something saying hello for a while," he said. "Around 1, I think. We figured it was drunk campers from another site." "Did you go check?" He looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing the question. "No," he said. "We figured it wasn't our business." She drove out of the campground without stopping at the host site again. The drive home was 4 hours. She cried somewhere in the second hour, not dramatically, just her eyes filling and the road going blurry and her having to pull off at a rest stop for 10 minutes. She wasn't sure exactly what she was crying about. The fear, some of it, but also the specific loneliness of having experienced something she couldn't explain to anyone in terms they could take seriously, and the knowledge that she was going to have to decide how much of it to tell and to whom, and whether the telling would make it better or only more real. She told her college friend the designated contact on the phone that evening. Her friend listened carefully and did not dismiss it, and asked 3 practical questions and then said, "Are you okay?" Which was the right question. Priya said yes, mostly, and meant it. She posted the account on a hiking forum she'd used for years. Trail conditions, gear reviews, campsite recommendations, the ordinary currency of people who spent time outdoors. She changed the campground's name. She described the site as a state forest campground, late October, site at the end of the loop. She described the circuit sound and the voice, and the tent wall and the camp host's instruction, and the disturbed leaves in the morning. She posted it and didn't check the responses for 2 days. When she checked, there were 41 replies. Most of them were what she expected. Skepticism, jokes, alternative explanations offered with varying degrees of kindness. But one was a direct message from a username she didn't recognize, sent 6 hours after she posted. The message was short. The person said they'd read her account. They said they'd been camping the previous October weekend. Different campground, different state, several hundred miles north, and had heard a voice saying hello outside their tent in the middle of the night, twice, with no variation between the 2 times, and had not unzipped. They asked if her camp host had said anything useful. She wrote back and told them what he'd said. It's a noisy woods. She asked where their campground was, what the site had been like, whether there was a camp host who might have warned them. The person replied once more. They said there had been no camp host. They said they'd asked the camp office in the morning. They said the camp office staff member, a young woman working a seasonal position, clearly not someone with years of context, had listened to the description and had looked uncomfortable and had said she wasn't sure what that would have been, and had offered to file an incident report. The person had declined the incident report. They had not camped alone since. Neither had Priya. She still camps with friends, in sites with clear sight lines to other occupied spots. She picks her site carefully now, never the last one on a loop, never the one furthest from the facilities, never the one where the tree line comes closest to the tent pad. She always checks the perimeter in the morning, a habit that her friends have noticed and that she deflects by saying she's checking for ant hills. She doesn't unzip until daylight. She hasn't stopped thinking about the message from the other camper, the different campground, the different state, the identical experience. The thing that was saying hello outside her tent had apparently said it before, somewhere else, to someone else, in the same way, which meant it had been doing it for at least a year, which meant it had been doing it in more than one location, which meant wherever she camped, she was not necessarily in a different place than she'd been before. Dale's hunting partner was a man named Cody, and Cody had been hunting Cutter's Ridge with Dale for 16 years, which meant he was not a person who called out sick on opening weekend unless he meant it. Dale got the text at 5 in the morning while he was still in his truck in the parking area at the bottom of the logging road, Fever since yesterday, not going to make it, sorry. And sat with it for a minute before deciding it didn't change anything. He knew the ridge. He knew the stand. He'd walked that access road in the dark enough times that his feet knew the grade of it. The place where the roots came up through the gravel at the third bend. The exact point where the logging road leveled before dropping to the gate. He texted back, "Feel better? I'll check in tonight." Then he got his gear out of the truck. Cody sent one more message while Dale was locking the tailgate. "Don't go to the east stand today. Something was moving wrong up there last weekend. We'll check it after season." Dale read it. He put his phone in his breast pocket. He shouldered his pack and his rifle, and he walked to the gate and unlocked it with his key, a flat key on a worn brass ring that the timber company had issued with the lease arrangement, and started up the logging road in the dark. The east stand had the best sight lines on the property. Positioned at 1,100 feet on a spur of the main ridge, it looked down into a long hollow that funneled deer movement between two creek drainages. Dale had taken a buck from that stand 3 of the past 5 seasons. Cody knew this. Cody also knew that something moving wrong in the woods was a category that covered a wide range. An aggressive buck, a bear working a territory, a coyote pack moving through, any number of things that were real and biological and unpleasant to encounter but explicable. Cody was not a dramatic person, but he was also not someone who went looking for the east stand on a day when something had bothered him up there. Dale was in the stand by 6:15, settled before first light, the way he always was. He ran through his checks without thinking. Wind direction, scent, position, sight lines. The hollow below the stand dropped away in a long V shape, old hardwoods on the slopes, a narrow creek at the bottom that he could hear faintly in the pre-dawn quiet. The leaves were down, which was good for visibility and less good for silence. Dry leaves in October meant everything that moved made noise, which meant he would hear deer before he saw them and would hear other things before he saw them as well. He settled into the stand the way he settled into the work of waiting, which was the largest part of hunting, and the part most people outside of it didn't understand. It wasn't passive. It was a sustained and active stillness, every sense running quietly under the surface, attention distributed rather than focused, the way a good driver's attention is distributed across everything at once, rather than fixed on one point. He poured coffee from his thermos at 7 o'clock. A doe moved through the hollow at 7:30, working the creek bottom, unhurried, not what he was looking for, and he watched her until she disappeared around the hollow's lower bend. The morning warmed slightly as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and the light came at an angle through the hardwoods, turning the leaf litter gold and amber in patches. At 9:15, he heard something in the hollow below. Dry leaves moving. The sound was low and slow, not the quick light sound of a squirrel, and not the deliberate weighted sound of a deer stepping. Something moving at ground level, close to the ground, progressing through the leaves in a way that was irregular. A few feet, a pause, a few feet more. He assumed turkey. Turkeys moved this way, slow and investigative, covering ground in a searching pattern. He watched the hollow floor below the stand and waited for one to appear. Nothing appeared. The sound continued for 3 minutes by his watch and then stopped. No bird, no movement visible, just the hollow going quiet again. He marked the spot by a downed log he'd used as a visual anchor before. The sound had been coming from somewhere between the log and the creek, maybe 40 feet of ground he could see clearly from the stand. Nothing was on that ground. He went back to watching. His coffee was gone. The light had shifted. At 10:40, the sound came back. Closer. He heard it before he located it, the specific quality of the sound reaching him before the direction resolved. Dry leaves, ground level, the irregular stop-and-go pattern, but closer now, somewhere in the lower hollow rather than at the creek. He raised his scope and moved it slowly across the hollow floor. He found it. Light-colored, pale, the color of old birch bark or dry grass, except nothing in that hollow was birch, and the grass on the slopes was brown, not pale. Low to the ground, lower than a deer's belly, lower than a coyote's back, moving in a way that his brain kept trying to categorize and kept failing to. Not flowing the way a large animal flowed when it moved. Not mechanical. Something between the two. A motion that suggested both deliberateness and wrongness. The way a gate looks when something is using its body in a way the body wasn't built for. He tracked it through the scope. It moved parallel to the creek, heading toward the near slope, crossing in and out of the shadows the hardwood trunks threw at that angle. He lost it twice and found it again. 40 yards from the stand, maybe, 50 at the most. A crow called from somewhere up the ridge. Loud, 3 times, the kind of alarm call crows used for raptors and for other things. The shape stopped, not slowed. Stopped, with an immediacy that was itself wrong, because large animals slowed and stopped. They didn't simply cease movement at one instant and hold completely still the next. The shape was motionless in the leaves. It held its stillness with a quality that felt less like an animal freezing and more like something waiting to see what would happen next. The crow called again. The shape stayed still. Then the crow stopped and the shape began moving again, resuming from the exact point where it had stopped, continuing on its parallel course toward the near slope. Dale watched it move. He was methodical about it, moving the scope slowly, keeping the shape in the lower third of the field of view. He had 23 years of hunting behind him. He had seen every animal in these mountains behave in ways that seemed wrong until context revealed the reason, and he ran through the list systematically, the way a practical man runs through possibilities before landing on a conclusion. He could not make this fit anything on the list. At 11:20, the shape moved into a section of the hollow where the light came in more directly, a gap in the canopy where a storm had brought a large oak down 2 seasons ago. The opening still raw enough that grass and forbs were colonizing it, but the full shade hadn't returned. The pale shape moved into this light and slowed and stopped and turned. It oriented toward the stand. Slowly, in the way that large things change direction when they weren't hurrying, and then it was facing uphill, facing the stand, and through the scope Dale could see that it had oriented itself with a specificity that was not general, not the broad directional awareness of an animal that had scented something on the wind and turned to assess it. It had turned to face the stand. He could see that it was not an animal, and then he could see the face. He did not lower the scope right away. He held it for 2, maybe 3 seconds, the reticle steady on the shape in the gap in the canopy, and in those seconds his brain did what brains do when they receive information they have no framework for. It tried, with increasing urgency and decreasing success, to find the framework. It cycled through everything he knew, everything he'd seen, every explanation available to a 58-year-old man who had spent half his life in these mountains and believed in them without mystifying them. He lowered the scope. He did not raise it again. The hollow was quiet below him. The crow had stopped. The creek sound was gone, which he registered without being fully aware that he was registering it. He sat in the stand with his rifle across his lap and his scope lowered, and he looked at the space in the canopy gap 40 yards below him without looking at what was in it. The leaves in the hollow made a small sound. He sat in the stand for 40 minutes after he lowered the scope and did not look at the hollow. He was aware of the shape. Not visually. He kept his eyes on the near slope above the gap, on the tree line at the ridge, on the sky, on his own hands. but aware of it the way you're aware of something in your peripheral field that you have decided not to look at directly. He could hear the leaves, small sounds, irregular, the stop-and-go pattern he'd been tracking since 9:15. It had not left. It was still in the hollow below him, moving in its way, and he sat above it in the stand and waited. He counted his breaths. He checked his watch once, 11:58, and put his wrist down and did not check it again. He thought about Cody's text. Something was moving wrong up there. Cody had been up here the weekend before and had seen or heard enough to send that text and had not elaborated, because there was no elaboration available. The sentence was complete as written. Something was moving wrong. That was the entire description, and it was accurate, and it was the most precise language that could be applied to the thing in the hollow below the stand. At 12:40, the leaf sound stopped. He waited 10 minutes, 15. The hollow was quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet before the shape had appeared. Not emptier, but settled, the way a room feels after someone leaves it. He could hear the creak again. He could hear a woodpecker somewhere on the upper slope. He counted the sounds, building a picture of the hollow from audio alone, and what the picture told him was that whatever had been down there had either moved on or had stopped making sound, and he could not determine which of those was better. He climbed down. He descended the stand the way he always descended, deliberate, one hand on the metal rungs, rifle slung, eyes ahead. He stepped off the last rung onto the leaf litter and stood at the base of the tree and looked at the hollow. The gap in the canopy was 40 yards away, downslope. He could see the downed oak and the open ground around it, and the pale light coming through. The ground in the gap was empty. He stood at the tree and looked at the gap for a full minute, and nothing in the gap changed. He turned upslope and walked toward the logging road. He did not take the direct route back, which would have required descending to the hollow floor and crossing at the creek. He took the long road up and around the spur, staying high on the ridge, adding 20 minutes to a walk that normally took 30. He did not examine his decision to do this. He walked at a pace that was not hurrying but was not his usual pace either, covering ground with the specific efficiency of someone who has decided that covering ground is the priority. He emerged onto the logging road at the ridge line and turned toward the gate. The road was straight here, a quarter mile of it visible before the first bend, and he walked it without looking back. He noted the sound of his own boots on the road surface, the familiar crunch of gravel, the ordinary weight of the rifle on his shoulder. He focused on these things. The gate was at the bottom of the road, 200 yards below the last bend. He reached it and stopped. The chain was off the gate. Not broken, the chain was intact, he could see that. It was hanging on the fence post on the right side of the gate, looped over the post the way you'd loop a chain when you wanted to keep it close to hand. The padlock was still locked, closed through the last link. He stood at the gate and looked at the chain on the post, and the padlock locked through it, and tried to work out the sequence of actions that produced this result. The chain threaded through the gate's latch mechanism and through a loop in the fence post, and the padlock went through both ends. To remove the chain, you unlocked the padlock, slid the chain free of the latch and the loop, and then you had the chain loose. The padlock was locked. He had the key in his breast pocket, the flat key on the worn brass ring, the only key. The chain had been removed from the latch and the loop with the padlock locked, which was not a sequence of actions that was physically possible with this equipment by any person who did not have the key. He stood at the gate for a moment. Then he unlooped the chain from the post, threaded it back through the latch and the loop, unlocked his padlock, put the chain through both ends, and locked it again. He did this methodically, the same way he'd done it that morning, And then he stood on the roadside of the gate and looked at it and found nothing wrong with it, because the chain was correctly threaded and the padlock was correctly locked and the gate was correctly closed. He took his phone out of his breast pocket and texted Cody. I saw it. The phone rang 40 seconds later. Cody's voice was rough with the fever, but alert. The alertness of someone who had been waiting for a specific message. Where? Cody said. East Hollow, below the stand. Did you get out? I'm at the gate. A pause. Don't go back. Not a question, not a suggestion. The same grammar as the original text. The same flat certainty. We're not going back to the east stand. The chain was off the gate, Dale said. Padlock still locked. Chain was just on the post. Cody was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't go back." Again. And the repetition meant he didn't have anything to say about the chain, which meant the chain was worse than the rest of it somehow. Worse than whatever Cody had seen the weekend before that had made him send the text. Dale drove home. He did not renew the timber lease when it came up the following spring. He told the company he was reducing his hunting activity due to work demands, which was not true, but was sufficient. He did not return to Cutter's Ridge. He told the story twice more in his life after telling his brother, the narrator's father. The narrator knows this because the father mentioned it, the fact of the additional tellings, without describing their content. He said Dale had told 2 other people the father didn't know, in the years after the ridge. He said Dale had told them carefully and had chosen who to tell with a specificity that suggested he'd been thinking about who would understand it and who wouldn't. The father asked once what Dale had seen in the scope in those 2 or 3 seconds before he lowered it. Dale said, "It looked like it was pretending." The father asked what it was pretending to be. Dale said, "It had the right parts, they were just in the wrong places." The father didn't push further. He told the narrator this account years later, in the same conversation where he mentioned that Dale had told it 2 more times to 2 other people. The narrator asked his father what he thought Dale meant by the right parts in the wrong places. His father thought about it. He said he figured Dale meant it looked like a person, roughly, that it had things that corresponded to the parts a person had, but that the correspondence was approximate rather than accurate, the way a copy is approximate, recognizable as an attempt at the original without being mistakable for it. The narrator asked, then why couldn't Dale say that directly? Why the careful phrasing? His father was quiet for a moment. He said he thought it was because there was one detail Dale hadn't included in that description. One specific thing he'd seen in the 2 or 3 seconds through the scope before he'd lowered it. One thing that didn't fit even within the framework of approximately right parts in approximately wrong places. Something more specific than that. Something that had made Dale put the scope down and not raise it again. The father knew the detail. Dale had told him. He'd told the narrator's father the full account, including the one detail, on the condition that the father didn't pass it further. The father has honored that. The narrator doesn't know the detail. He knows it exists. He knows his father knows it. He has asked twice and his father has given the same answer both times. Dale told him not to pass it on. That's the end of the line. The narrator says he thinks about that sometimes. The thing his father knows and won't say. The thing Dale saw in 2 or 3 seconds through a rifle scope in a hollow in Southwest Virginia, and then spent the rest of his life deciding who to tell and how much. The detail that gets withheld across every telling, that gets smaller and smaller as the story passes from person to person until it exists only in his father's memory, and will go with his father when his father goes. The narrator says he thinks that's probably the right outcome, that some details are better contained than circulated, that his father is doing the correct thing, keeping it where Dale put it. He says this, and then he says, "But I do think about it. I think about what you see in 2 or 3 seconds that makes you put a rifle scope down and never raise it again. In 23 years of hunting. On a ridge you've known your whole life. I think about that." The co-worker's name was Jen, and she sat 2 desks over from the woman in the account, and the recommendation had come up the way recommendations came up in offices. Sideways in passing. The kind of conversation that happens beside the coffee machine on a Thursday afternoon when someone mentions they're looking for somewhere quiet for a long weekend and someone else says, "Oh, I think I know a place." That was how the woman remembered it. Jen, Thursday, the coffee machine. A specific cabin in a specific hollow in the West Virginia mountains, private road, very quiet, $90 a night. The woman had written down the name of the listing site on a post-it note and had booked it that evening. She remembered this clearly. She remembered Jen's exact words. "It's very private. You'd have the whole hollow to yourself." And the way Jen had seemed pleased to have a recommendation to offer. She and her husband called him Marcus in the account, though that wasn't his name, and she was referred to only as the woman, which also wasn't accurate, but was what she'd asked for when she submitted the account. No names, no identifying details. The county changed, the dog's name kept, because she couldn't bring herself to change it. The dog was Bo. 3 years old, shepherd mix, 70 pounds. The kind of dog that slept at the foot of the bed and met strangers with patience and had never in 3 years shown anything that looked like fear. They drove up on a Friday afternoon in early September, Bo in the back seat with his head out the window for the first 2 hours and then asleep on his side for the last 40 minutes. The gravel road was 6 miles off the secondary highway, and it took longer than it should have because the road was narrow and the canopy was dense enough that the afternoon light barely reached the surface, which made the ruts and washouts harder to judge at speed. The woman navigated from her phone, signal dropping in and out, while Marcus drove. The cabin sat in a clearing above a creek that they could hear before they saw it, a small sound in the hollow that the tree cover amplified into something larger than the water warranted. The clearing was maybe half an acre, the cabin at its upper edge, a ridge behind it that rose steeply through old hardwoods. No other structures visible, no power lines coming in. The listing had mentioned solar panels, and she found them on the south-facing roof when she looked. 3 panels that accounted for the lights and the small refrigerator and not much else. Bo got out of the car and put his nose down immediately and worked the perimeter of the clearing in his systematic way, covering the ground in long arcs, returning to the car once and then going out again. The woman watched him. He went to the edge of the clearing where the woods began and stopped there, nose up, reading something in the air. He stood at the tree line for about 30 seconds. Then he came back to the car and sat beside it and looked at the cabin. He did not go to the tree line again. She noted this but did not name it. He was in a new place, new smells. The creek was loud enough to mask things a dog would normally hear from a distance, which could make an unfamiliar environment feel uncertain. She had explanations and she used them. They unloaded the car. Marcus carried the cooler and the bag with the cooking supplies. She carried the overnight bags and the dog's things. Bo walked with them to the cabin door and inside, and made his inspection of the interior with his nose, and then settled on the rug near the wood stove and watched them unpack. The cabin was comfortable. 1 bedroom, a sitting room, a kitchen along one wall, a covered porch facing the clearing. Old furniture, clean. A wood stove she didn't know how to use and didn't need to. September was cool, but not cold, the nights dropping to 50 at most. The kind of rental that had been a family place before it became a rental. The furniture staying through the transition. The curtains on the windows faded to a shade lighter than their original color. She found the guest book on the kitchen windowsill. Standard composition notebook, the same as every other guest book in every other rental cabin she'd ever stayed in. She flipped through it while Marcus started on dinner. Entries going back 4 years, sparse. This was not a heavily booked property. Couples mostly, a few solo entries, the usual language. Beautiful and quiet, very private. We'll be back. She read the last few entries more carefully, out of the idle habit of reading what recent guests had thought. The entry 8 months ago said, "Wonderful cabin. Peaceful hollow. Nights are long here. Bring something to read." The entry 14 months ago said, "Lovely spot. We heard some wildlife at night, nothing alarming. Very quiet days." The entry 2 years ago, the last entry before those two, was longer than the others. She read it twice. It said, "We had a strange experience on our second night that we won't describe in detail here. We're not sure what to make of it. The cabin itself is lovely. If you have a dog with you, keep it inside after dark. We learned this late and we wish we'd known sooner." She stood at the kitchen windowsill and read that entry twice. Then she put the guest book back and went to help with dinner. She didn't mention it to Marcus. She told herself she was being practical. The entry was vague, deliberately vague. The kind of vague that covered everything from a bear encounter to a noise complaint to a couple's argument about whether to sleep with the window open. It didn't say anything specific enough to act on. She'd tell him later if it seemed relevant. After dinner, they sat on the covered porch in the last of the light, Bo between them, and watched the clearing go dark in stages. The far tree line first, then the creek bank, then the clearing itself. The cabin's porch light becoming the only source of illumination. The porch light was a single fixture above the door, a warm bulb that lit the porch and the immediate clearing and threw the tree line into shadow. Bo sat between their chairs. At some point, she couldn't identify exactly when, he moved from between the chairs to in front of Marcus's chair, positioning himself facing the clearing. Not lying down, sitting upright, ears forward, she looked at what he was looking at. The clearing, the edge of the porch light's reach, the darkness beyond it where the woods started. She couldn't see anything. Marcus noticed Bo's posture and looked too and said nothing. They sat on the porch for another 20 minutes, and Bo did not move from his position and did not lie down and did not look away from the clearing. They went inside. Bo came without being called and did not look back at the clearing when they closed the porch door. The woman locked it. Marcus checked the window latches, a habit from the city, carried into places where it was less obviously necessary. One latch on a window above the kitchen sink was loose. He propped it with a paperback book he'd brought for the trip, the book wedged between the frame and the window to keep it from swinging open. He moved on to the other windows and didn't mention it again. They went to bed. Bo settled at the foot of the bed, which was his usual place. At 1:10 in the morning, Bo raised his head. She was half asleep and she felt it before she heard it, the specific shift in the mattress when Bo moved, familiar enough that it woke her. She opened her eyes and lay still. Bo was sitting up at the foot of the bed, facing the bedroom window, which was on the north wall facing the clearing. She could not see his face from where she lay, but she could see his silhouette in the faint light from the window, the ears up, the posture alert. He made no sound. That was the part she remembered most clearly. In 3 years, when Bo was alerted by something, he growled. A low sound, more feeling than noise, but present. He growled at the mail slot and the garbage truck and the neighbor's cat and the time a raccoon got onto their apartment building's fire escape. He always growled. He did not growl now. He sat at the foot of the bed and faced the window and was completely silent, and the silence was worse than a growl would have been because a growl was something she knew how to interpret. She watched him for 5 minutes. He did not move. She told herself the creek, the unfamiliar place, a deer at the clearing's edge. She was most of the way back to sleep when Bo lowered himself slowly onto the bed, lay flat, and put his head on his paws. She felt the tension leave him, not the sudden release of a dog that has decided there's nothing to worry about, but the gradual lowering of a dog that has decided to wait. She slept. The second night, Marcus heard it first. They were both awake at the time. It was 12:50. She'd checked her phone when she couldn't sleep, and they'd been lying in the dark not talking about not sleeping. The comfortable married version of that. Bo was at the foot of the bed, awake. Had been awake for 20 minutes by her estimate. From the tree line, at the edge of the clearing, in the dark beyond the porch light's reach, a voice. Bo. One word. Her voice, the woman's voice. Or something so close to it that Marcus turned his head toward her in the dark, the reflexive turn of a person who has just heard their partner speak from an unexpected direction. She put her hand on his arm. She had not spoken. They lay still. The guest book entry moved through her mind. Keep it inside after dark. We learned this late. The gas station attendant, they had stopped for gas at the last station before the county road. A small place with 2 pumps and an older man working the register. He had looked at Bo in the back seat and said, "Keep it inside at night. Don't let it out if it hears something. And don't call its name after dark if you can't see it." She had thanked him and driven on, and had not thought about it again until this moment. The voice said, "Bo," again, from the tree line, in her voice, and Bo at the foot of the bed did not move and did not make a sound. Marcus's hand found hers in the dark and held it. Neither of them spoke. The cabin was quiet around them. The refrigerator's small hum, the creek outside, the September night settling into its coldest hour. Bo at the foot of the bed had not moved. He was lying flat with his head on his paws, but she could feel through the mattress that his body was rigid, the stillness of a dog holding itself in deliberate check rather than the loose stillness of a dog at rest. The voice did not come again. They lay in the dark for a long time after. She counted the sounds she could identify: refrigerator, creek, wind in the ridge hardwoods above the cabin, and held the count like an inventory, something to return to when her mind moved toward the tree line and the voice that had come from it. Marcus held her hand and did not let go and did not speak. At some point past 2 o'clock, she heard the porch boards. One creak, then another. The specific sequence of the loose boards she'd learned in 2 days of walking that porch. The third board from the door, and then the second, which meant something moving from the clearing side toward the cabin wall. The weight of it was real. Not wind, not settling, not the pop of wood temperature shifting in the night. Weight moving across the porch in 2 steps and then stopping. Marcus's grip on her hand tightened. They lay still. Bo, at the foot of the bed, had lifted his head. She felt the mattress shift with it, and was facing the bedroom window, the same window he'd faced the first night. Not the door. The window which faced the porch. Nothing else happened. No knock on the door. No sound on the porch after the 2 creaks. She lay there and thought about the window above the kitchen sink, the loose latch, the paperback book wedged against the frame. She thought about how far the kitchen was from the bedroom. She thought about whether she'd heard the window. She had not heard the window. She told herself she had not heard the window because there was nothing to hear, because the book was still in place and the latch was still propped and the window was still closed, and the porch was quiet now, and the voice had stopped and Bo was lying back down. She told herself this, and she held Marcus's hand, and she watched the ceiling and waited for dawn. It did not come quickly. At 6:20, the light through the bedroom curtains was gray and certain, the kind of light that required no interpretation. She sat up. Beau raised his head. Marcus was already awake, had been awake, she thought, for most of the last few hours, lying still in the way of someone who has stopped trying to sleep and is simply waiting. She got up first. She walked to the bedroom door and opened it, and stood in the doorway looking at the main room. Ordinary. The sitting room furniture, the wood stove, the kitchen along the far wall. Light coming through the east-facing windows, pale and flat. She looked at the kitchen window above the sink. The paperback book was on the floor. It was lying flat on the kitchen floor beneath the window, spine up, pages splayed from the fall. The window above it was latched. Not propped, not ajar, latched, the latch handle in its closed position, seated correctly in its keeper, the way she'd seen Marcus work to seat it the night they arrived. She stood in the doorway and looked at the book on the floor and the latched window above it, and understood the sequence that produced this result. The book removed from between the frame and the window. The window opened, the latch engaged from inside, the window closed. Or, the window opened from outside through the gap the book created. The latch engaged from outside through the opening. The window pulled shut. The second sequence required a reach through a gap of about 2 inches, which was the gap the loose latch created when propped, to engage a latch mechanism 4 inches from the edge of the frame. She was still standing in the doorway when Marcus came up behind her and looked over her shoulder and was quiet for a moment. "Get Beau," she said. She read the guest book fully while Marcus loaded the car. She stood at the kitchen windowsill and went through every entry from the beginning, reading carefully. And she found what she found. 3 entries in 4 years that mentioned sounds in the night. The entry from 2 years ago she'd read the first evening. The entry from 14 months ago, wildlife at night, nothing alarming. She read again and found less reassuring than before, because wildlife at night, nothing alarming, was the description of someone who had decided not to be more specific in a public guest book. And a third entry from 3 years ago that she had skimmed the first evening without registering. Beautiful place. One piece of advice: don't use your pet's name after dark outside. Learned the hard way. Everything fine, just don't. 3 entries, 3 separate visits, 3 separate parties, the same pattern. She put the guest book down. She carried her bag to the car. Beau walked beside her and got into the back seat without prompting, and did not look at the tree line. They drove the 6 miles of gravel road to the secondary highway and turned south and did not discuss what had happened. Not that morning, not that afternoon, not that evening at home. She wasn't sure if not discussing it was a decision they'd made or simply a thing that happened, the way certain subjects became uncrossable without anyone designating them as such. She did the dishes. Marcus made dinner. Beau lay on the kitchen floor and watched the back door. 2 weeks later, she messaged Jen. She kept it simple. She said they'd stayed at the cabin Jen had recommended and asked if Jen could tell her anything else about the place. Any context. Anything she knew about the hollow or the property. Jen replied within an hour. Her message was short and mildly confused in tone. "I don't think I recommended a cabin to you. I wouldn't know anywhere like that in West Virginia. You might be thinking of someone else." She read the message 3 times. She was not thinking of someone else. She had a specific memory. Jen, Thursday, the coffee machine. The post-it note she'd written the listing site's name on was still in the pocket of the cardigan she'd been wearing that day. She found the cardigan and found the pocket and found the note and confirmed that it existed. She had written it herself, in her own handwriting, while standing beside the coffee machine on a Thursday afternoon. She did not respond to Jen's message. That evening, she opened the listing site and searched for the cabin by the details she remembered: the county, the hollow, the private road, the solar panels. She found it. Still listed, still $90 a night available. She opened the listing and scrolled through the photos and the description. Under house rules, at the bottom of the listing, below the standard items about quiet hours and parking and fire safety, there was a line that had not been in the listing when she'd booked. She was certain it hadn't been there because she'd read the house rules before booking, as she always did. The line read, "Please do not call pets by name near the tree line after dark." She sat with that for a while. Someone had added it. After they'd stayed, or after someone else had stayed, or after enough people had stayed that the addition became necessary. A property management decision, worded with the specific restraint of someone who understood that explaining the rule fully would raise questions they weren't prepared to answer in a public listing. The minimum language that conveyed the instruction without conveying the reason. Someone had learned that the rule needed to be there. They had put it there in the most neutral possible phrasing. They were still renting the cabin. She closed the laptop. Marcus was in the other room. Bo was on the kitchen floor. She sat at the table and thought about the guest book entries and the listing rule and Jen's message and the paperback book on the kitchen floor and the window latched from the inside and the voice from the tree line that had used her voice to say her dog's name. And she thought about the gas station attendant who had looked at Bo in the back seat and had known, without being told, that they were going to the hollow. She thought about that last part the most. The attendant who had offered the instruction unprompted, who had looked at the dog and said, "Don't call its name after dark if you can't see it," as if this were information specific to their destination rather than general rural advice. As if he'd known where they were going. As if the hollow and the rule were associated in his mind, connected. The destination implying the instruction the way a specific road implied a specific caution. She has not gone back. She does not call Bo's name outside after dark, not at home, not anywhere. A habit that took hold without her deciding to form it. Marcus noticed after about a month and asked about it, and she said she wasn't sure. She'd just started doing it, and that was true enough. Bo still sometimes sits up in the night and faces a window, not often. Once a month, maybe, she lies still when it happens and listens and hears nothing and waits for him to lie back down, and eventually he always does. She hasn't decided what that means. She hasn't decided whether it means the same thing as present, somewhere outside, checking whether she's still there. Whether the rule she follows now, don't say his name outside in the dark, prevents the thing from confirming her location, or whether it makes no difference at all and the thing simply finds her by other means and she just doesn't hear it. She doesn't know. She thinks about it on the nights Bo sits up. She lies still and listens, and does not call his name and waits for the light. The hollow had a name on the county plat maps, Redbud Hollow, for the trees that came in thick along the creek bank in April. But nobody in the family called it that. They called it the Back Hollow, or sometimes just the Hollow, the definite article doing the work of distinction because there was only one hollow that mattered when the family talked about the land. Orville's land. The piece his father had farmed before him and his grandfather before that. A narrow strip of bottomland running the length of the hollow with the creek on one side and the ridge rising steep on the other. Old-growth timber on the upper slopes that nobody had ever logged because the slope was too steep to get equipment on. And the timber company that had owned the mineral rights in the 1940s had decided the access cost outweighed the value. Orville had farmed the bottom fields his whole life. Corn, mostly, and a kitchen garden his wife maintained close to the house, and a small tobacco allotment in the years when that was still worth managing. He knew the hollow the way a person knows land they have worked since childhood. Not romantically, not with the soft focus that people who haven't farmed tend to apply to farming, but practically, in the specific grammar of soil and drainage and what the creek did in a wet spring, and where the deer came through and where they didn't and why. He was not a superstitious man. His daughter, the narrator's grandmother, said this about him consistently across every version of the account she gave over the years, and she said it the way you say something that is both true and relevant, not as a preamble to undermining it but as genuine context. He went to church on Sundays because his wife went, and because the community went, and because it was the right thing to do in the county where he lived, but he was not a man who organized his understanding of the world around invisible forces. He was a man who organized it around weather and soil, and the behavior of animals, and the reliability of equipment, and the honesty of neighbors. He had one exception. The rule about the hollow came from his father, who had gotten it from his father, which put its origin somewhere in the late 1800s on the same piece of land. The grandmother didn't know if there had been a specific event that generated the rule, or whether it had accumulated gradually, the way rules accumulate when a pattern repeats enough times across enough generations that someone finally puts language to it. The language, as it reached Orville, was plain. If it hollers back at you from up there, you don't answer. You walk home. You don't run. You walk. Up there meant the upper end of the hollow, where the walls narrowed to about 40 feet across, and the ridge pressed close on both sides, and the timber was oldest, and the light left earliest. The family had a fence line at that end, the back fence, marking the boundary of the cultivated bottom before the hollow's throat closed and the ground became too steep and rocky to work. Beyond the fence was timber and ridge and whatever was up there, and the family's relationship with up there had always been managed through the rule. Orville had never had cause to apply it. He had hollered across the hollow plenty of times over 60-plus years of working that land, called to his wife from the far field, called to his children when they strayed toward the creek, made the wordless sounds a farmer makes just to hear his own voice in a quiet place. The hollow had echoed back correctly every time, the way hollows did, a sound returning from the ridge walls with the slight delay and the slight softening of distance. He had never heard what his father described. He had begun, in the practical way of a practical man, to consider it a story rather than a rule. This was September. The specific year the grandmother gave was 1973, which she knew because her youngest brother had started school that fall, and she remembered the detail of Orville coming in from the back fence that evening, while the family was still at the supper table. Her brother still in his first week of school clothes, the particular quality of the light in the kitchen. She was 11. She remembered the evening clearly. Orville went out after supper to check the back fence. This was a regular thing. Every few weeks, more often in fall when the deer pressure on the fence increased ahead of winter. He took his tools in a canvas bag and walked the bottom fields in the last of the September light, which lasted longer in the hollow's lower section and left earlier at the upper end where the ridge walls blocked the western sky. The grandmother didn't watch him go. She was helping clear the table. The kitchen window faced east toward the creek, not toward the back fields. She didn't see him leave and didn't think about him leaving because he did this regularly and was always back before dark. The evening was warm for September, the kind of evening that felt like summer making a last argument for itself before giving in to the season. The creek was low. It had been a dry August, and the sound it made was smaller than usual, a trickle rather than a run, which meant the hollow was quieter than it was in wet months. Orville would have noticed this. He noticed these things. He reached the back fence at the hollow's upper end and worked his way along it. checking staples and pressing on the posts and looking for places where the deer had pushed through. The fence ran across the hollow's width at its narrowest point, from the east slope to the west slope, 40 feet of wire strung on cedar posts that he'd set himself 15 years before and maintained since. At the east end of the fence, where the post was set into the slope and the wire went up at an angle to meet the ridge's first rocks, he stopped and looked up the hollow. Past the fence, the timber closed in immediately, big hemlocks and old hardwoods, the canopy meeting overhead in the narrow throat, the ground beyond the fence in permanent shadow even in September afternoon light. The creek, what there was of it, continued past the fence into the dark section. He called across the hollow. His own account, as the grandmother reported it, was that he called the way he sometimes called when he was working the back fence alone. Not calling to anyone, just sending his voice out to hear it come back. A single sound, the kind without specific meaning. The echo returned, correct. The slight delay, the ridge wall taking it and returning it, the familiar acoustics of that particular section of the hollow. He went back to the fence. 3 or 4 minutes later, he was near the center post by then. He called again, and this time he used a word. He said, "Hey," or something close to it, the word a person uses when they are not calling to anyone in particular. The echo came back. And then, 3 or 4 seconds after the echo should have ended, it came back again. Not a clean return, something softer, slightly different in pitch, like the word had passed through something on its way back that had altered it. Not, "hey," something that ended differently, ended in a vowel that wasn't the right vowel. He stopped working. He stood at the fence post and listened. He thought about what his father had told him. If it hollers back at you from up there. He had always interpreted hollers back as meaning a response, something that came from up the hollow without being generated by him first. He had not considered the version where it took what he sent and returned it, changed. He decided he was hearing the creek. The dry September creek playing tricks with the hollow's acoustics, bending the return in ways that full water flow wouldn't. He had explanations and he used them. He worked the rest of the fence. He was near the west post when he finished, the end closest to the slope where the timber company's old access road had been cut into the hillside and was now just a seam of different vegetation. And he straightened up from the last staple and began gathering his tools. He did not call again. He was 30 yards from the fence, walking back toward the lower fields, when the hollow made a sound he had not sent. A voice. From the upper end, above the fence, from somewhere in the dark, narrow section where the hemlocks closed the canopy, and the creek continued in its dry September trickle. Not his voice. Not any voice that belonged to the hollow. A voice saying one word with the particular clarity of something said at a distance that carries, not loud, not shouted, but clear across the 40 feet of hollow width and the 30 yards of field between him and the fence. The word was his wife's name. He stopped walking. He stood in the backfield in the last September light with his tool bag in his hand and his wife's name in the air of the hollow. And he thought about his father, who had told him the rule the way you told someone a thing they needed to know rather than a thing you wanted them to believe. He had said it without drama. He had said it once, repeated it once, and had not elaborated beyond "you walk home and you don't run." Orville stood in the field. Behind him, up the hollow, past the back fence, in the dark section where the hemlocks closed and the light had already left. Silence. The word was gone. The creek made its small sound. The evening birds had stopped. He did not turn around. He put one foot in front of the other. That was the whole of it. The complete survival strategy distilled to its simplest form. Left foot, the bottom field solid under his boots, the house lights visible at the far end of the hollow where the land opened up and the creek bent east. He walked toward those lights with the specific unhurriedness of a man who has been given an instruction he intends to honor exactly, not approximately. His father had been precise about the walking. Not running was not just a practical suggestion about not attracting attention or not tripping in the dark. It was the rule itself, the core of it, and Orville understood this the way you understand a thing when it stops being theoretical. He was 30 yards from the fence. The house was 200 yards from the fence. He walked. The hollow was quiet behind him. No creak sound, which he registered without turning. The same absence he'd noticed in the last few minutes at the fence. The September low-water trickle gone silent in a way that had nothing to do with the water level. The evening birds were still. The wind that had moved through the upper canopy off and on all afternoon had stopped. The hollow behind him was producing no sound at all, which his body registered as pressure rather than peace, the specific pressure of a space that is being occupied by something that is not making noise. He kept walking. At the halfway point, 100 yards from the fence, 100 yards from the house, his wife's name came again. Same voice. Same distance, or approximately the same distance, which meant it had not moved closer in the time it had taken him to cover 100 yards of field. Same clarity. The word carrying across the hollow width without apparent effort. His wife's name, said once, and then the hollow went quiet again and stayed quiet. He did not answer. He did not stop walking. His father's voice was in his head with a completeness that surprised him. Not as a memory, not as a recollection of a specific conversation, but as a presence, the words arriving with the weight they'd had when first spoken. You don't answer, you walk home, you don't run. He had not thought about those words in years. They had been sitting in the back of his mind for 40 years, waiting for the evening when they would be needed. And now they were needed and they were there. And he was grateful for them with a gratitude that had no room for anything else. He walked. He reached the house steps at the far end of the hollow, where the bottom land met the yard, and the yard light his wife had installed the previous spring threw its cone of yellow light over the porch and the near yard. He stepped into that light. He turned around. The back fields were dark. The hollow's lower section was visible to him. The field, the creek bank, the fence line at the far end, a pale line in the darkness marking the wire. Beyond the fence, the hollow's throat was black, the hemlocks closing it completely, no depth visible. The field between the fence and where he stood was empty. The fence line was unbroken. Nothing was on the fence line. Nothing was in the field. He looked at the hollow's upper end for a full minute, standing in the yard light with his tool bag in his hand, and the hollow gave him nothing. No movement, no sound, no shape against the darkness that was darker than the darkness around it. The September night settled around him. Ordinary. The creek resuming its small sound somewhere beyond his hearing. The evening birds beginning again in the lower trees near the house. He went inside. His wife was at the table, the younger children still finishing supper. The grandmother, 11 years old, her brother in his first week of school clothes, looked up when Orville came in and later said that she noticed his face before she noticed anything else. The quality of it, not frightened exactly, but altered. The way a face looks when something has rearranged the person behind it without leaving visible marks. He set his tool bag by the door. He washed his hands at the sink. He sat at the table and ate what his wife put in front of him, and the family finished supper the way families finish supper, and afterward his wife began clearing the table, and Orville sat with his coffee cup and waited until the children had left the kitchen. Then he said to his wife, "Don't go to the back fence after supper anymore." His wife looked at him. She was a woman who had grown up in the same county, on different land, and who understood the hollow the way anyone understood land they had lived beside for decades. Not with Orville's specific working knowledge, but with the general literacy of someone for whom this landscape was simply home. She looked at him and waited. He said, "It hollers back." His wife was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." And she went back to clearing the table. And that was the entirety of the conversation, because his wife had grown up in that county and she knew what "it hollers back" meant without needing it explained. She never went to the back fence after supper. Neither did Orville after that evening. He checked the fence in the mornings before noon, in the full light of day when the hollow's upper section was brightest and the timber above the fence was penetrable to the eye. He never went in the afternoon again, never in the evening, and he never again sent his voice into the upper end. Not a call, not a word, not the wordless sound a farmer makes to hear his own voice in a quiet place. The grandmother remembered these changes because they were changes, departures from a pattern she'd grown up with. Small but specific alterations in how her father moved through the land he'd worked his whole life. She asked him about it once, 2 or 3 years after the September evening, the age she was then making her brave enough to ask and young enough to believe she'd get an answer. He said, "Some parts of the land have their own rules. You learn them or you don't." She asked which rule he meant. He said, "Don't holler into it if you're not prepared for what hollers back." She didn't ask again. She raised her own children on that land after Orville and his wife were gone, for a decade before she and her husband moved to the county seat when the children were in school. She raised them with one specific instruction about the back hollow that she gave the way Orville had given her the rule. Once, clearly, without drama, as information rather than warning. You don't go to the back fence after supper, and you don't call into the upper end, and if you hear something from up there, you come home and you don't run. Her children followed the rule without questioning it, the way children follow rules that are delivered with that particular gravity. The narrator is the grandchild of one of those children, which makes the rule a 4-generation inheritance by the time it reached him. Orville's father to Orville, Orville to the grandmother to her children to the narrator's generation. Orville died in 1987. The land passed through the family for a few years after that, farmed less and less, as the family dispersed to the county seat and then beyond. By the early 1990s, nobody was living on the property. The family sold the bottom fields and the house in 1994. The new owner, a man from out of state who had ideas about the land that the narrator's grandmother described as not practical, lasted less than 2 years before selling again. The hollow has changed hands 3 times since the family sold. It has not been farmed since Orville's children left it. The narrator does not know the current owner, or whether anyone has lived in the house in the past decade. He drove out to see the property once, in his late 20s, on a trip through eastern Kentucky that took him through the county by design rather than accident. He knew the road. His grandmother had described it enough times that he found it without looking at a map. The gravel county road, the gap in the ridge where the hollow opened, the old farm entrance with its metal gate. The gate was there. Old, the paint worn to primer and then to rust in places. The tubular frame the same style as the farm gates all through that part of the county. Posted. A no trespassing sign wired to the gate frame, orange and white, county standard. He pulled off the road and sat with his engine idling and looked at the gate. He sat there for a few minutes, long enough to think about getting out and walking to the gate, looking through it at the bottom fields, maybe calling into the hollow to hear the acoustics of it, to understand what Orville had heard and what he'd been hearing back. He did not get out. He could not have said exactly why. There was no specific fear involved, no sound from beyond the gate, no visible reason to remain in the truck. It simply did not seem like a good idea, in the same wordless way that a great many things do not seem like good ideas when you are sitting at the edge of a place that has had a rule about itself for as long as anyone in your family can remember. The rule was not his to test. It had never been his to test. It had been given to him the way it had been given to everyone before him. Not as a challenge or an invitation, but as a plain instruction from people who had learned it the hard way and did not want him to have to. He started the truck and pulled back onto the county road and drove south. He has not been back. His grandmother, and the last time he spoke with her about the hollow, said one thing he's thought about since. She said that as a girl, playing in the lower fields in the afternoon, she had sometimes heard the hollow make a sound when no one had called into it. Not often. 3 or 4 times across the years she'd lived on that land. A sound from the upper end, from the dark section past the back fence, that was not the creek and not the wind and not an animal she could identify. She described it as checking, like the hollow was checking to see if anyone was home. She said she'd never answered. She said the rule covered that too. If you didn't send anything into it, you didn't answer what came back. You went about your business. You let the hollow do whatever it did in its upper end, in the dark section where the hemlocks closed and the light left early, and you did not engage with it. And over time it, or whatever was up there, using the hollow the way the hollow used sound, seemed to understand that this family knew the rule and was going to keep it. She said it mostly left them alone. The narrator asked, "Mostly?" She looked at him. She was in her 80s by then, clear-eyed, not a woman who dramatized things. She said, "There was the September your great-grandfather came home from the back fence. There were 3 or 4 times I heard it checking when I was a girl. And there was once, when I was grown and your mother was small, and I brought her back to the land to see where I'd grown up. There was once in the late afternoon, when I had your mother by the hand, and we were walking the lower field, and I heard it from up there, one sound, and I turned us around and walked back to the car, and I didn't run." She said, "Your mother never knew. She was too small to understand what I heard. I didn't tell her until she was an adult, and when I told her she said she didn't remember the afternoon, but she said there was something about that land she'd always felt without being able to name. Something about the upper end of that hollow. She said she supposed some things passed through people whether you told them or not. The narrator doesn't go to that hollow anymore. He doesn't call into empty places where the walls come close and the light leaves early. He has driven through that part of eastern Kentucky twice in the years since, and has taken the county road that runs past the hollow's entrance both times. And both times he has not stopped, and both times he has felt, without looking at the gate, without slowing, the particular quality of a place that is aware of you, even when you are trying to be in motion. He doesn't know what that is. He doesn't know if Orville knew. He thinks the rule was never about knowing. He thinks the rule was about what you did with what you heard and what you didn't do, and the specific discipline of walking home at a steady pace when everything in you wants to run. Some places you just don't holler into. You don't always know why. You just don't.